No matter what happens, don't stop! We almost got it! Two treasure seekers are digging frozen ground in a cornfield at night. It's raining hard, lightning is flashing, but these two guys keep working. And now the shovel hits something solid. No way! A treasure chest! They start digging faster and find a piece of a ship's engine. What the? Far from the seas and lakes, somewhere under the fields of Kansas City, they found a giant sunken ship. How is this possible? Now you'll see. Some people spend their lives searching for shipwrecks with treasures underground. One of them is explorer David Hawley. He's been looking for such ships far from the seas, rivers, and oceans for many years. He does this because he likes the feeling of adventure. The holds of these ships may contain chests of gold, antiques, and artifacts. And you can get a lot of money for them. David says you don't have to go into the ocean to find a sunken ship. They may be lying in your backyard. But why do ships end up buried underground among fields, farms, and plains? Let's find out using the example of steamboat Great White Arabia. According to old records, the newspaper clippings, this ship had been carrying about 200 tons of treasure before it sank in 1856. Many rumors and local legends said the ship was lying underground a few miles northeast of Kansas City. It was there because people deliberately altered the riverbed and channels of the Missouri River in the second half of the 19th century. They artificially brought the shores closer to each other. They narrowed the river to increase the flow's speed, so boats could sail much faster. In the 19th century, steamboats were the most popular means of transporting passengers and goods. Before railroads, they extended the western border across the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and brought supplies to people. That's why it was so important to increase the speed of their movement. So, on September 5, 1856, Arabia was sailing along such an estuary. It came across a snag sticking out of the water. A piece of log quickly flooded the ship. Fortunately, all passengers were evacuated. But the steamer and its precious cargo reached the silt bottom of the Missouri River in a few minutes. Several years had passed. Everyone forgot about the vessel. During this time, the course of the Missouri River had changed. But Arabia remained under the wet, muddy bottom. The soil level above it was getting higher, and the ground was losing moisture. Eventually, many decades later, a cornfield formed above the sunken ship. In the 1980s, one farmer owned this area, and he had no idea what was hidden in his territory. David Hawley carefully studied the history of the sunken ships of the USA. He knew that hundreds of steamers had gone underwater all over Missouri, but most of all, he was interested in Arabia, as there were rumors that it was filled with gold and other valuable things. The territory of cornfields in Kansas was vast, but David Hawley knew how to search properly. In 1987, he started working, first together with his brother and father. They collected all the clippings from old newspapers they could find. They were looking not only for information about the steamer, but also for maps of the Missouri River. They tracked its historical changes, checked the dates, and identified a large area where the steamer sank. Next, they used electromagnetic testing and other geological stuff to study the soil and find the right place. They searched for differences in ground moisture and density. Then, they went through the territory with powerful metal detectors. And so, by the fall of 1988, they had determined the location of the steamer. Arabia was the size of a football field. This gigantic vessel lay 45 feet underground, 4 stories down. But before they started excavating, they had to ask the owner of the cornfield for permission. For the farmer, this news was a big surprise. He agreed, on the condition that the excavations would be completed by spring so that he could sow a new crop. Digging a giant ship in winter is much more difficult and expensive than at other times. It includes additional equipment, electricity, and heating costs. The team worked day and night. They financed the excavations out of their own pocket. Each invested more than $10,000 and took out a bank loan. Finally, they noticed the first details of the ship. The shovels hit the huge engine boilers and the deck. The goal had been achieved. Most of the cargo lying inside the sunken ships is covered with rust, shells, mud, and is badly damaged. The contents of Arabia were in excellent condition, considering that the ship had sunk 130 years prior. Unfortunately, they didn't find the chests of gold. Still, they got several tons of other valuable cargo, household items of people who lived in the middle of the 19th century. It was a time capsule. The ship was carrying supplies for hundreds and thousands of people, and all these things were perfectly preserved. For example, they could clearly see the brand stamp Goodyear Rubber Company on one rubber shoe. The longer the excavations continued, the more things David and his team found. In the barrels, they found plates from the 19th century. They were intact and usable. Also, there were clean clothes, thousands of pairs of shoes, harpoons, frying pans, and umbrellas. The ship was carrying cargo to supply about 16 small towns. Yes, it's not gold, but such artifacts are also precious. The contents of the ship could be worth millions. However, the crew wasn't going to sell these things. They made a museum on the site of a former fruit market in Kansas City. If you go there, you will immediately feel like you're in a department store of the 19th century. There are thousands of items in good condition. Even the matches here are dry enough to light up. It took David many years to present the entire collection from the steamship. He values each of the items and doesn't want to sell them. Anyone can come here, pay for a ticket, and find themselves in the past. Who knows, maybe there's an old ship hidden in your backyard too. Geologists found an older vessel in the hot desert of Namibia in 2008. This ship sailed back in the days when pirates scared sailors on the seas, and now it's inside a dried-up lagoon. The ship sailed from Lisbon in 1533 and disappeared with the crew near a small diamond mining town. After almost 500 years, the hull had been badly damaged. Only the carcass of the ship remained, but the treasure hidden inside the vessel stayed intact. They carefully studied the boat for a long time, trying not to ruin anything. And then, 5 days later, they found a big old chest in the hold. Carefully opening it, they found gold coins there. Thus, the cost of the ship was estimated at about $10 million. The exact cause of the shipwreck is unknown, but experts believe the ship was destroyed by heavy cargo and bad weather. It went to the bottom of a lagoon that later became a desert. Some find an airplane in their backyard, others discover a ship, and one man found a passage to an ancient secret city in his house. This happened in Turkey in 1963. The owners of the building decided to make repairs. He went to his basement and knocked down the wall to turn this place into a living room. And so, behind one wall, he found a tunnel leading underground. The man thought it was some kind of a secret chamber. He went down there and realized it was something much more than that. It was an ancient city 18 floors deep. People built it in the years 780 to 1180 as a refuge from weather disasters and the invasion of enemies. This place also includes many underground tunnels that stretch for several miles in different directions. People could get to the town from different points using secret passages leading to these roads. The city can accommodate about 20,000 residents, livestock, and tons of food supplies. Archaeologists have also found a chapel, schools, stables, and public kitchens there.
The year was 1865. It was a boom of migration worldwide, with novel places discovered and new settlements created. Without planes like we have now, a ship was the only way to escape from the old life and journey towards a new, hopefully brighter future. So, a voyage like that was quite a regular thing to do. More than 500 immigrants safely reached Queensland, and the ship was supposed to head back to London sometime later. It was indeed a long journey, but not many people were willing to return to England. After all, they had chosen to come to Australia to create a brand new life. So it was only natural that the ship would come back nearly empty. However, the return trip was still quite lucrative, thanks to the cargo the ship would carry. The amount of produce ready to be shipped was substantial, primarily consisting of wool soaked in arsenic, tallow, and hides. It was two birds with one stone. Not only could the crew wait out the winter, warm in Australia, while England endured bitter cold, but they also wouldn't waste their time. With the sheer volume of produce to be loaded, it would take them around 3 months to accomplish this task. Reports were circulating that the Fiery Star was almost done loading up, but it turned out that the assessment was a bit too optimistic. To pass the time, Captain Ewell thought it would be a good idea to reach out to the Acclimatization Society and offer to help transport any animals they wanted to send to England on the Fiery Star. He already had some emus and kangaroos on board, but there was still room. The society held a vote, and they were totally on board, pun intended, with Captain Ewell's idea. They figured sending some Taligalas would be a great plan. Even though a few of these birds were already in England, the French Society needed a couple, and they could get them shipped there through England. Little did the crew know that all this cargo, all the produce they were willing to sell in England, would ultimately lead to the ship's destruction. Not only was the Fiery Star lost, but most of the people on board did not survive to complete the voyage. March 23rd. That was the day when the ship manifest was finally published. A manifest is a list that details the cargo, passengers, and crew of a ship, plane, or vehicle, primarily for customs officials. This document helps those involved in the transport verify that everyone and everything that was loaded is still on board when the vehicle reaches its destination. Once it's published, it means the ship is almost ready to depart. There were three possible ways of passenger accommodation. First, there was the saloon, the antiquated name for first class. Next, there was the second cabin, which is, logically, second class. Finally, there was the steerage, the cheapest form of passenger accommodation on a ship. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many people traveled from their homelands, often to North America and Australia, looking for a fresh start. Most of them were poor and had limited funds for travel. In total, there were 8 people in the saloon, another 8 in the second cabin, and only 21 steerage passengers. Out of the 37 passengers, only one, John Omond, would make it out alive. He bought a ticket for the steerage, so unlike the Titanic situation, in this case, the class didn't really matter. The crew members list wasn't as detailed as the passengers. It was known that, in total, there were around 55 people in the crew, from able-bodied seamen to crew members simply called boys. But there's something telling me that the crew wasn't really that important for the captain. In reality, all that mattered to him was to make as much money as possible, shipping tons of dangerous, flammable cargo. Out of over 50 crew members, only 17 survived that voyage. But there was actually one more crew member who actually survived it all, just because they weren't let in. Sarah Johnson disguised herself as a man and planned to sneak onto the ship. However, something about her looks made the captain get suspicious, so he called the police and made Sarah leave the ship as he didn't want any immoral behavior to take place. Well, he saved her life. For him, it was the last voyage. The captain, W. Hunter Ewell, was quite a celebrity apparently. He already had a record of the safe landing of immigrants in the previous year, so there seemingly was no reason to worry. The trip promised to be safe. Clipper Fiery Star left Moreton Bay bound for London. The passengers took their places. The cargo had already been loaded. The full list is astonishing. In addition to all the wool, tallow, cotton, hides, and horns, there were also 6 cases of arrowroot and various other packages. And we can't forget the animals the captain took aboard too. The Fiery Star was far away, yet still observable to the east as it headed toward the Pacific Ocean. This was the last information available until May 26, when news of its destruction emerged from Brisbane. Chief Officer William Sargent's log reveals that the Fiery Star took 12 days to reach the southern tip of New Zealand, passing on April 11, 1865. The trip was going well until heavy seas ruined 2 longboats on April 17. On this day, a strong odor of smoke alerted the captain. When he checked, he found the lower hold completely filled with smoke from a fire fueled by the ship's flammable cargo. The hatches were quickly closed to try to contain the flames, but by the next day, the heat and toxic smoke had forced passengers out of their cabins. George Maber was one of the lucky survivors. He was the ship's engineer, and he recalled the chaotic events on April 20th as Captain Ewell and most of the crew and passengers tried to evacuate in rough weather. At around 6 p.m., the ship took on water, and without much warning, Captain Ewell, 4 crew members, and a few female passengers hopped into a lifeboat and headed out. The next boat, managed by the second mate, Mr. Adio, was a gig, followed by a crowded jolly boat. Lastly, there was a waste boat, which was barely seaworthy, with 2 men constantly bailing water to keep it afloat. The plan was for the boats to stay close to the Fiery Star overnight and head for the Chatham Islands the next morning. But by dawn on April 21st, all 4 boats had vanished without a trace. On the burning ship, there were 17 crew members and passenger John Oman, who banded together under Chief Officer William Sargent's leadership. For 5 days and nights, George Maber pumped water on the fire without rest. He volunteered to go down the forehatch with a rope around him and a handkerchief over his mouth. He discovered that the foremast had been burned through for about 7 inches, and the port side was severely damaged, resembling an empty shell. Exhausted, he returned for fresh air, but later descended again with Quartermaster Marshall to access a water tank. They couldn't open the lid, and as George crawled over the hides, he felt himself sinking. When they reached the deck, they collapsed from exhaustion. The cargo had been destroyed by smoke and fire, and the heat on the deck was intolerable. The crew survived on limited rations and caged chickens, using every spare piece of wood, including pigsties, for the pumps. Distressed pigs ran wild in the heat. A raft was constructed, but was too weak for the open sea. Sleep was elusive, and the crew had lost everything, with only hopes of reaching land or meeting another ship. Finally, the Dauntless appeared and sent a lifeboat to the Fiery Star. Captain Moore boarded the Fiery Star on May 12th, and after assessing the situation, he agreed that the crew could do no more. They boarded the Dauntless at 4 p.m., witnessing the Fiery Star succumb to flames by 11:30 p.m. It was a narrow escape.
There's a stretch of water that even the most experienced explorers fear. No matter what season you choose to cross it in, you risk meeting face-to-face with waves that can reach as tall as the Hollywood sign. I'm talking about the Drake Passage, the waterway connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from Cape Horn at South America's southernmost tip to Antarctica's South Shetland Islands. It's about as wide as the distance from London to Berlin and takes up to 48 hours to cross. Some sailors compare getting on the other side to going to the moon. That's how challenging it is. Even the man who discovered it, Sir Francis Drake, never sailed these waters because they seemed too dangerous to him and opted for a calmer, although longer, Strait of Magellan. The passage took the lives of around 20,000 sailors and over 800 ships. Tourists who want to see Antarctica cross the Drake Passage on a regular basis, although it's still often called the world's most terrifying ocean crossing. The Antarctic Peninsula, where travelers go, isn't really part of Antarctica itself. It sticks out and points towards South America like 2 fingers almost touching it. The water gets squeezed between these 2 land masses, making strong ocean currents. The passage is part of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current on Earth. The water rushes through the passage at a speed between 95 and 150 million cubic meters per second, which makes it rougher. And then there are winds that usually blow from west to east and are very strong between 40 and 60 degrees latitude. That's why those areas are called the Roaring Forties, Furious 50s, and Screaming 60s. Land slows down winds, which is why storms hitting Ireland and the UK get weaker as they move east. But Drake's latitude is the only place where winds can blow all around the Earth without being stopped by land. So they keep getting faster. These strong winds turn into huge waves that can hit ships really hard, normally around 13 to 16 feet tall. They're much higher than waves in the Atlantic. Drake Passage also has underwater mountains that you can't see. The huge current squeezes through this narrow passage and causes waves to crash against these mountains underwater. These internal waves create whirls that bring cold water up from the deep ocean. So it's not just rough on the surface, the water is wild all the way down. The first sailor managed to sail around Cape Horn and through the Drake Passage in 1616. It was a Dutch navigator, Willem Schouten, in 1616. But the most famous attempt to cross it was undertaken by Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton on his ship named Endurance. He and 27 of his men set off from South Georgia, aiming to reach Vassal Bay in Antarctica. But things didn't go as planned. On January 19, 1915, their ship got stuck in the ice. And by October, it began to sink. They camped on floating ice for 2 months before sailing lifeboats to a remote, icy place called Elephant Island. Shackleton and 5 men made a risky journey to South Georgia to get help. It took them 15 days to cross Drake Passage with hurricane winds. Finally, they arrived safely and organized a rescue for the rest of their crew. Scientists found the shipwreck of Endurance only in 2022, 10,000 feet below the water. In December of 2019, 6 fearless athletes decided to cross the Drake Passage by rowing a boat for the first time in history. It took them 12 days of non-stop rowing with a 90-minute rotation of rowers. They managed to do it, and it was probably the hardest possible way to cross the passage. The athletes mentioned it was cold, wet, and dirty, and the waves hit them like walls. The weather in the Drake Passage changes a lot, but ship captains can always see it coming and change their path. They will move the departure time to have a safety margin and not to get stuck in the middle of the passage in the worst possible conditions. Sometimes, the journey will be smooth and calm, and they call it Drake Lake. Other times, people on the ship will feel rough waves, which is called Drake Shake. Some experienced captains who often cross the passage say that the Drake Lake effect happens once in every 10 crossings. And they see the Drake Shake once or twice in every 10 journeys. A schooner or a kayak will probably not survive the journey among giant waves, but modest vessels and cruise ships have sturdy hulls and advanced stabilizing mechanisms. So, the journey isn't that dangerous anymore, but still, it's quite an adventure, especially if you're seasick. If you don't feel like risking it but want to travel from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean by water the fast way, the Panama Canal is waiting for you. People first started thinking about making a water path across Panama in the 16th century. Back then, a Spanish explorer found out that only a thin piece of land separated the two oceans. But it seemed impossible to build it because of the mountains and thick jungle, so the idea had to wait a couple of centuries. Finally, in 1880, France, led by the man who built the Suez Canal in Egypt, tried to make the canal. But the people who started the construction soon found out it was much harder than it looked on a map. The land in Panama was one of the toughest and most dangerous places to dig a big waterway. Workers had to literally move huge mountains in a jungle full of snakes, where it was really hot and rainy. During the wet season, heavy rain turned rivers into wild rapids and soaked the workers. Sometimes, they didn't see the sun for 2 weeks, and their clothes stayed wet all the time. Big rocks were falling, and tiny mosquitoes that carried malaria made people very sick. And then, an earthquake happened on top of everything. They were losing thousands of people. That's why France decided to abandon the project after 7 years. Then, the United States bought the French assets in the canal zone and finished it by 1914. It cost the US around $375 million. The 50-mile-long passage of water saves ships traveling between New York and San Francisco 7,872 miles. Around 14,000 ships use it every year and pay around $1.8 million in tolls. So it looks like it all paid off. Another challenging waterway in this part of the world is the Amazon River. It's around 4,300 miles long and flows through 3 countries with over 30 million people living in its basin. But there isn't a single bridge across it. The river has many marshes and soft soils, so engineers would need to build very long bridges and very deep foundations, which costs a lot of money. Building bridges over deep water is tough, but in other places in the world, engineers can use things like floating platforms to help. The river's path and water levels change a lot during the year. During the dry season from June to November, the river is usually 2 to 6 miles wide. But in the wet season from December to April, the river can become as wide as 30 miles. And the water level can rise by 50 feet. That's why they can't build floating bridges or pontoons. The riverbanks are made of soft dirt that moves and erodes with the seasons, and it makes things even harder. It would have to be an absolutely unique project to overcome all these challenges. Luckily, there's no pressing need for a bridge across the Amazon right now. The river mostly goes through areas that are sparsely populated, so there aren't so many major roads to be connected by bridges.
There's a ship drifting somewhere in the ocean without a crew. The last time someone saw it was over 50 years ago. Its story reminds of that of the Flying Dutchman, a ship that's bound to sail forever and bring disaster to whoever sees it at sea. At least the legend says so. Unlike the Flying Dutchman, the SS Bay Chimo was definitely real and built for a German company in Hamburg and began as an ordinary cargo ship. It was trading supplies between Hamburg and Sweden in the Baltic Sea starting from 1914. It had a strong steam engine and a hull made of steel. A few years later, it became British property. Then, in the 1920s, a Canadian company purchased it for around $18,000, a huge amount of money back then. The new owner, the Hudson's Bay Company, was actively using the ship for several years. They would often send it on voyages from its home port in Scotland to Siberia, Alaska, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. It also passed through the Panama Canal and even the Suez Canal, with fur pelts for sale on board. Sometimes it would also transport passengers. It had completed 9 successful voyages before this strip of good luck came to an end. Starting from the 1930s, SS Bay Chimo would have trouble with ice and storms. When it first got trapped in ice in October of 1931, some of the crew managed to escape to Alaska. 15 of 22 sailors decided to stay with their vessel and try to save it. They had furs and other valuable cargo worth around $58,000 aboard. The company sent them supplies to survive the winter. They set camp near the ship out of the hatches, tarpaulins, and other materials, and offloaded the cargo. At the end of November, a blizzard rushed through the area, and it seemed like it had taken the ship with it. The ice platform had survived, but the ship broke free. Some of the crew members were sure it had sunk. But soon after, they heard from one of the locals who had spotted their ship around 45 miles away from their camp. The crew moved on with their lives, and the ship started its journey as a runaway vessel. People would spot SS Bay Chimo once a year or so, all the way until 1965. It was mostly spotted off the coast of Alaska. A man going to Nome with his sled dog, along with prospectors, explorers, and treasure hunters, all claimed to have seen SS Bay Chimo. Someone tried to board it and take it to port, but ended up stranded on it for days because of horrible weather. Others got luckier and managed to take a whaleboat, some furniture, and other valuables from the vessel. Those who got close to the ship saw that it was damaged and missing the propeller. Still, it stayed afloat without a crew for at least 38 years and became the longest sailing ghost ship in history. In 2006, the Alaskan authorities started a project to solve the mystery of this ghost ship of the Arctic and finally find SS Bay Chimo, either still above or below the water. So far, the project has not been a success. SS Bay Chimo remains one of the estimated 4,000 ships that have disappeared off Alaskan shores. If the legend of the 17th century isn't lying, this ghost ship could be sailing somewhere along the Flying Dutchman. It belonged to the Dutch East India Company. Its captain managed to do the impossible for that time and sailed from Holland to Indonesia in only 3 months. They said he was flying over the sea, and some evil tongues explained that he had made a deal with evil forces to achieve that. Once the ship was sailing back home, its captain and crew disappeared without a trace. There are many versions of what happened to it. One of the first ones said it had tried to enter port at the Cape of Good Hope, got in a terrible storm, and sank as there was no captain to save it. Another legend says the captain had refused to obey the skies to let the ship sink during the storm. A scary life form then struck the boat and the crew, and it was condemned to forever wander without rest. Many sailors claim to have spotted the Wandering Dutchman. The Duke of York, who was to become King of England, mentioned having seen it in Australian waters. Right after spotting the ship, the man who saw it first fell from the top of the mast and didn't survive. There were more encounters with this legendary ship up to the middle of the 20th century. Ships would nearly collide with it as the Flying Dutchman jumped out of the blue. Scientists have a more logical explanation for this mystery: Fata Morgana, not to be confused with Hakuna Matata. Now, when you're out at sea on a hot day and the air is all wavy, it feels like when you look at the road on a scorching summer day. That's because of something called atmospheric refraction. When light passes through different layers of air with different temperatures and densities, it bends and twists. Sometimes, under certain conditions, this bending of light can create really bizarre optical illusions over the ocean, like sightings of the Flying Dutchman. The Fata Morgana phenomenon can make distant objects appear distorted, stretched, or even lifted above the horizon. So you can see a ship far away, but because of the way the light is bending, it will look like it's floating above the water or even disappearing and reappearing. A Fata Morgana is most commonly seen in polar regions, especially over large sheets of ice that have a uniform low temperature. But you can see it anywhere, even in deserts and over lakes on hot days. The first stories about ghost ships go all the way back to ancient Greek and Roman mythology. One of the most famous ghost ships in history is the Mary Celeste. This brigantine was traveling from New York City to Genoa and was fully stocked with provisions, but missing a crew when it was discovered in the Atlantic Ocean in 1872. The crew's personal belongings were also there, completely undisturbed. The final entry in their log was made 10 days earlier. We still don't know what happened to its crew, and the ship has inspired many spooky stories and legends. The Lady Lovibond was another legendary schooner that is believed to have been wrecked off the coast of Kent in the middle of the 18th century. The story tells that the ship's captain, Simon Reed, had just got married and took his bride on board for a celebratory cruise, despite the superstition that it could bring bad luck. They were on their way to Portugal when the first mate, who is also in love with the captain's new wife, went mad because of jealousy, attacked another crew member, and then took over the wheel and steered the ship straight into the dreaded Goodwin Sands. No one aboard survived, and the schooner is said to reappear as a ghost vessel every 50 years. In present times, many vessels become abandoned and turned into ghost ships intentionally. There are thousands of them floating in U.S. rivers, lakes, channels, and coastal waters. Some people lose their boats in storms and other extreme weather. Others have to abandon their boats because maintaining them can cost 10% of the boat's price. Plus, docking a vessel can add up to several $1,000s every year. Most boats have been made of fiberglass, so an owner can't just recycle them as scrap metal. So, once they want to get rid of it, they often tie it to a dock and sneak away, or leave it floating far away from the shore, or just try to sink it. When ghost ships sink in shallow waters, they can cause damage to coral reefs, mangroves, marshlands, oyster habitats, and wetlands. Plus, they can collide with unsuspecting regular ships and cause real trouble. So, don't do that. Enough said.
What is a boat doing in the middle of a desert? You would expect to find a seagoing vessel closer to shore. This is the question archaeologists have been asking for decades. In 1988, there was a storm near one of the most important archaeological sites in ancient Egypt. A wooden structure emerged from the sand. It was hollowed out by termites. Scientists were determined to solve its mystery. In 2000, they began excavating the site near Abydos, Abydos. An American team of experts soon discovered a boat that was 70 feet long, and it wasn't alone. In total, there were 14 boats neatly resting next to each other. It was impossible to completely dig out the boats because of their poor condition. Luckily, the wood was preserved enough to get a sample. Analyses revealed that the boats were around 5,000 years old. the oldest fleet in human history to this date. The time of their construction predates the pyramids at Giza by half a millennium. Each ship of the fleet rested in a vault that matched its dimensions. The room was roughly a third of the size of a tennis court. It had mud brick walls that featured more than 120 drawings of boats. Ancient Egyptians incised them on whitewashed walls that were excellently preserved. Scientists have known about these mysterious chambers for well over a century. 1901, 1902. A British archaeologist, Arthur Weigel, stumbled upon a strange structure west of the River Nile. His team caught a glimpse of the interior walls. Sadly, a section of the roof collapsed, so they had to call off further exploration. Researchers abandoned the site, but its location remained on the maps. The boat's position first led scientists to think that they rested on a bank of the mighty Nile. But there was a problem with this theory. Today, the river flows almost 7 miles west of Abydos. Further studies of the surrounding terrain showed the Nile didn't change its course throughout history. Also, if the boats floated near a dock, they would be in unstable positions. The 14 vessels at Abydos were perfectly parallel to each other. There was only one conclusion possible. Someone had deliberately placed them like that. They must have gone through a lot of effort. Each boat had enough room for up to 30 rowers. These vessels could really float. They weren't models, but scholars still don't know if they actually sailed any body of water in ancient Egypt. This doesn't diminish the importance of the find. Previously, archaeologists found only small-scale models. In King Tut's tomb alone, there were 35 boat models. For a long time, these figurines were the only clues as to how ancient Egyptian vessels looked like. The boat's design confirms that they were the real deal. They are the earliest surviving examples of something called built boats. Ancient people constructed primitive vessels by hollowing out large tree trunks. The alternative was reed that was tied together to form a raft. The boats at Abydos had planks tied together. This was a major breakthrough in shipbuilding. During their lifetime, the boats must have seemed impressive. Timber was a valuable commodity at the time. There was no wood in the desert. Cedar had to be imported from Lebanon. The only person who could afford such luxury was the pharaoh. Studying the area around the ancient fleet provided more answers. Scientists discovered a mud brick structure where Egyptians worshipped the pharaoh. Its approximate date of construction matches that of the wooden boats. The same bricks out of which this building was made were used to encase the fleet. At the time of their construction, the rooms they were stored in had a ceiling. That's the section that archaeologists stumbled upon in the early 20th century. Just like mummies and coffins, these marvelous ships rested inside splendid vaults. The exterior of these rooms was also impressive. The outer walls originally had a plaster of white limestone. It reflected sunlight. In the desert sun, the structure housing the boats must have shone from miles away. Ancient Egyptian builders used the same technique to cover the pyramids 500 years later. Today, their surface looks jagged, but it wasn't always like this. When they were constructed, the pyramids had a top layer of fine white limestone. Their surface was smooth and it gleamed in the sunlight. Instead of stairs, the outer layer of the pyramids was more of a sleek ramp. Archaeologists were left with one final question. Which pharaoh owned the fleet? The answer lay just a mile from the site. This is where the tomb of a pharaoh from the 5th dynasty rested, King Senwosret III. Its time and style of construction matched the ones of the chambers with boats. The very end of his rule might explain how the boats ended up in the middle of the desert. The pharaoh probably passed away in northern Egypt. Then his body was transported down the Nile to Abydos in a marvelous procession of decorated boats. The vessels were later lowered to chambers near the final resting place of their owner. This had a symbolic meaning. In the ancient Egyptians' belief system, ships played a key role. Their supreme deity was Ra. He traveled through the sky during the day in the form of the sun. At nighttime, he sailed through the netherworld in a solar boat. The pharaoh identified himself with Ra. That's why he needed boats in the afterlife. That was the only way to regenerate himself. Just as the sun rises every day above the horizon. This belief existed for thousands of years. The more famous Pharaoh Khufu also had a ship. Scientists found it in 1954 next to his pyramid at Giza. It is some 4 centuries younger than the fleet at Abydos. But Khufu's ship was almost 2 times longer. The Great Pyramid of Giza and King Tut's tomb are some of the most famous archaeological finds in Egypt. But there are many more secrets hiding beneath the endless sands of the Sahara Desert. Recently, 2020, archaeologists found a lost city there. They have labeled it as the most important discovery since King Tut's tomb, 1922. The city of Aten is some 3,000 years old. Historians hope it will give them a unique insight into the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. The famous archaeologist and Egyptologist Zahi Hawass proclaimed the site a lost golden city. Aten sits some 300 miles south of Egypt's capital, Cairo. It is close to the famous Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists first found sections of mud brick walls that spread out in all directions. They discovered complete rooms with tools of everyday life inside. The research team unearthed a bakery, a residential neighborhood, and an administrative district. They all date back to the time when the Egyptian civilization was the wealthiest in its long history. They were also the first to make objects from iron. In 1911, scientists found a set of iron beads near a village in Lower Egypt, El Gerza. These are the earliest known iron artifacts. The discovery is literally out of this world. Ancient people made them by beating into shape a piece of a meteorite. The 9 beads were once part of an ornate necklace. They are now blackened and corroded, which is perfectly normal for a piece of jewelry that is over 5,000 years old. They consist of an iron-nickel alloy. Researchers were impressed by the skill of ancient jewelers who processed the beads. Their craftsmanship is more impressive when you think that they didn't know the stellar origins of the material. The Great Pyramid of Giza also has a remarkable feature. An international research group investigated the electromagnetic response of the structure to radio waves. They found that the pyramid has the ability to concentrate electromagnetic energy inside it. This occurred inside its chambers as well as under the pyramid's base. It contains an underground, unfinished chamber. It seems that the electromagnetic response is connected with the properties of limestone, the Great Pyramid's main building material. The research results might have a practical application. The way solar cells and nanosensors function could be improved by this remarkable find.
If I asked you to name the most famous shipwreck of all time, you'd go with the Titanic, right? The Atlantic Ocean, the hope for new life, heartbreaking love stories. It had it all to become a blockbuster. But I guess you've never heard of SS Princess Alice that submerged in the sewage of the River Thames, taking between 600 and 700 lives with it. Life in 19th century Victorian London wasn't easy, especially for working class folks. Affordable public transport and bank holidays made it a bit easier. The people could escape to the coast on a train or pleasure boat, even if it was just for a day. Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent started as a fort under Henry VIII and then grew into a bustling town with a dockyard. When they added a railway station in 1863, it became a prime destination for day trippers and holidaymakers. Seaside promenades, charming piers, and a whole bunch of fun stuff to do by the sea. It had it all. A bit inland along the River Thames, you had the Rocherville Gardens. These gardens had archery lawns, bowls, mazes, lakes, cliff walks, and even a floral bazaar. Plus, there was an aviary, a bear pit, and a skeleton of a lost whale that had taken a wrong turn in the Thames. Londoners of the late 19th century could hop on a train or cruise along the Thames by boat, and both options were pretty popular. But on the 3rd of September, 1878, way more people than usual opted for the boat. They chose it over the railroad after a passenger train had collided with goods wagons in Kent, taking the lives of 5 people. The river felt like a safer way to go. One of the ships available for the trip was the SS Princess Alice. The paddle steamer was first launched in 1865 on the west coast of Scotland. Its original name was the Bute, and it was used as a ferry for the passengers of the Wemyss Bay Railway Company. A couple of years later, it was sold and renamed after Queen Victoria's 3rd child. Then, it was sold again and got the nickname the Shah's Boat, as it transported the Shah of Persia up the Thames to Greenwich in 1873. The ship had gone through several alterations in its lifetime. It got new boilers and watertight bulkheads. The Board of Trade had inspected it and marked it safe. In the year of its final voyage, it was officially allowed to carry up to 936 passengers between London and Gravesend in calm water. On the day of the tragedy, Princess Alice was on what was called a moonlight trip downstream from Swan Pier near London Bridge to Sheerness, Kent and back. The trip wasn't expensive, so most of the passengers were from the working class. There was also a musical band aboard to keep the spirits up. The 3rd of September was a bright day, and many families were happy they could catch some final summer sun rays and enjoy fresh sea air. The then owner of the ship, the London Steamboat Company, had several vessels working on the route. The passengers were free to hop on and off different ships. At around 6:30 p.m., after a beautiful day in the open, the SS Princess Alice headed back to Swan Pier. No one kept official lists of passengers, so we'll never know exactly how many people were on board that evening. But they say the steamer was close to its full capacity. As it got darker and cooler, many families decided to stay inside the saloon or in their cabins below. Some stories from the steamer sound like fate. The captain of Princess Alice let his steerer stay at Gravesend and replaced him with one of the passengers. John Ayres was a sailor but had little experience at the Thames or with a vessel like Princess Alice. Alfred Thomas Merriman, a chef from East London, had been offered to work on the steamer at the last moment. He was 30 years old and a father of 4, so he couldn't say no to extra money. At around 7:40 p.m., he was standing on the deck by the saloon door. By that time, Princess Alice had passed Tripcock Point and entered Galleon's Reach. The passengers could see the North Woolwich Pier in the distance. Many of them planned to disembark at that stop. And that's when Merriman noticed a huge ship carrying coal. It was Bywell Castle. This vessel normally carried coal to Africa, but it had just been repainted at a dry dock. Bywell Castle was going to Newcastle to pick up some coal and transport it to Alexandria, Egypt. The ship's captain, Harrison, wasn't too familiar with these waters, so he called in Christopher Dix, a seasoned Thames River pilot, to lend a hand, even though he didn't have to. The ship had a fancy raised forward part below the deck, and Dix couldn't quite see what was in front of him. So, they had a sailor on lookout duty. As they set sail from Millwall at the speed of 5 knots, 5.7 miles per hour, they tried to stick to the middle of the river, but other boats had other plans. When they were approaching Galleon's Reach, Dix spotted Princess Alice's red port light, headed their way, but planning to pass on the right side. At the same time, Grinstead, the captain of Princess Alice, was going against the river's flow, trying to find the smooth waters on the south side. He adjusted his course, steering into Bywell Castle's path. Both crews realized they were headed for a collision. Dix tried to steer clear and even ordered reverse full speed on the engines, but it was too late. The Bywell Castle collided head-on with the Princess Alice, which was much smaller, weighing less than a third of the 890-ton coal-carrying collier. It sliced the passenger steamer in two. As Merriman remembered later, laughter on board immediately changed into screaming and panic. Some people rushed to the bridge for safety. Merriman hurried to the captain, asking what to do next. The captain's response was grim. "We are sinking fast. Do your best." The ends of the steamer went high into the air, and the middle just sank, taking passengers with it. Those unfortunate ones who were below deck were tragically trapped. The impact caused tons of untreated sewage to gush from outlets near the collision site. The water became a frothy mess of unprocessed waste with a horrible odor. It was potent enough to make even the most resilient sailors retch. Amid the chaos, passengers struggled for life in the contaminated water. They inhaled lungfuls of hazardous waste without knowing. The crew aboard the Bywell Castle sprang into action. They dropped ropes from their deck, urging Princess Alice's passengers to climb aboard. Anything that could float, from planks to barrels, was tossed into the water to serve as flotation devices for those in need. Other members of their team launched a lifeboat, saving 14 people. Nearby boats, moored along the riverbanks, joined the mission, plucking survivors from the water. Many of Princess Alice's passengers didn't know how to swim, and it was even trickier for ladies wearing long, heavy dresses. Merriman was among the lucky ones who could swim. He first held on to a piece of wreckage, and then, when others got to it, swam away and caught onto a rope hanging over the side of the Bywell Castle. They managed to save around 130 people this way. Another survivor was Robert Haynes, who played in the Princess Alice band. He was fond of ships and had noticed the Bywell Castle a couple of minutes before the collision. He chose not to follow the rest of the band, who went downstairs for a break, and that saved his life. Princess Alice's sister ship, Duke of Teck, arrived 10 minutes too late to assist with the rescue efforts. Only 2 people who had been below deck or in the saloon managed to survive the collision. We still don't know the total count of lives taken on that day, but it's somewhere between 650 and 700. And what makes this story even more tragic is that it has been mostly forgotten.
At the beginning of the 20th century, somewhere off the coast of West Africa, a German steamship was leaving the port. Suddenly, the weather got worse, and the vessel entered a thick fog. The sailors ran aground on a sandbank close to the shore. Luckily, no one was hurt, and they were even able to save their precious cargo. But the ship was stuck in the sand for good. And it was not alone there. Nearly the entire length of the western coast of Namibia is called Skeleton Coast. If the name sounds scary, that's because it is. This 976-mile-long beach line is among the most dangerous places on Earth. The local Bushman tribes believe that their supreme deity made this land when it was angry. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to set foot in Namibia in the 15th century. And yep, they didn't like Skeleton Coast either. Portuguese explorers thought this land presented the gates to the underworld. This is the place where the Namib Desert meets the Atlantic Ocean. It might be dangerous, but it's actually beautiful. Plus, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If Skeleton Coast had a PR manager, they would quit on the first day on the job. The area is not exactly tourist-friendly because of its geography and history. Beneath the sand and the waves, there is a secret ocean currently lurking for unsuspecting sailors. It's called Benguela Current. It flows towards the north along the coast of southern Africa. This part of the Atlantic is rich in marine life, but the current's land neighbor isn't that happy with the deal. This arid climate created the Namib Desert, one of the driest regions on Earth. And that marine life I just mentioned? It's sharks. 11 species of them to be exact. And yes, the great white decides to pop by once in a while. So far, we've got a desert landscape, strong currents, and sharks. Not a place for a beachside resort, definitely. But if someone ends up on Skeleton Coast, will they know they're in danger? Don't worry, they will. The beach is littered with wrecks of all sizes and shapes. If you remember that German ship I mentioned in the very beginning, its massive and rusted stern is now sticking out from the desert sand. There are some 500 wrecks in total scattered along the coast, and it's a mixed crowd, from Portuguese galleons centuries old to ships that ran ashore here in the 21st century. A modern fishing ship called Zela India managed to slip from its tow rope in 2008 and ended up on Skeleton Coast. Okay, it didn't escape on its own, it had some help from the elements. But it's better to be a tourist attraction on a beach than to be broken up for scrap. That's where the trawler was originally going, poor thing. Skeleton Coast's most famous inhabitant, to call it such a place, is the wreck of the Dunedin Star. The British cargo liner ran aground here in 1942. The massive rescue operation that followed reveals why it's so dangerous for sailors to end up here. The rescuers managed to save all of the crew and passengers, but at a heavy price. An aircraft and a tugboat were lost in the process. It took the last of the rescuers a full 2 months to return home to Cape Town. Why, you might wonder? One look at the map of the region reveals the reason. It's an endless sea of yellow, which is the sand. There are so few roads here, so Skeleton Coast is hard to reach by land. There are also legal obstacles. You need a special permit to drive into the area. But the skeletons in the name of the area don't only refer to ships, they also stand for animal bones. Most of these belong to whales and seals. Many animals have adapted to the area, so lions and hyenas roam the coastline in search of a meal. Yeah, now there are hungry lions as well, as if those sharks weren't enough. Other animals with a temporary residence on Skeleton Coast include elephants, cheetahs, leopards, and giraffes. In 1971, the Namibian authorities established a national park here, but except for surfers, after an adrenaline rush, they don't get many visitors. You can understand why. The Namib Desert is the oldest desert in the world, and it's not very tourist-friendly either. Those who travel to the region should pack sunscreen and a warm winter jacket. A weird combo, right? Well, not so much when you think that during the day, temperatures soar over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, the air temperature drops below freezing. What a climate roller coaster! And that's not the final danger. Yep, there's more. Remember how that German ship got lost in thick fog? Yeah, it wasn't a one-off event. Because of the region's climate, fog shows up frequently. Sailors should cover their ears now, but this fog is actually good for wildlife. This is their only source of water in the Namib Desert. Reptiles and mammals have adapted to the harsh climate. They use as little water as possible. Shifting sands, thick fog, strong currents, lions, and sharks. Not the stuff you would put in a tourist booklet, but Skeleton Coast isn't the only beach on Earth you wouldn't want to spend your vacation on. I will take you to Cape Tribulation in Australia. The area covers some 48 square miles in the northwestern part of the continent. And no, the area is not as dry as Skeleton Coast. It's part of the Daintree rainforest. You could say that here, it is the rainforest, not the desert that meets the ocean. The beach at Cape Tribulation is straight from a postcard. But looks can be deceiving. Australia? Probably sharks. No, crocodiles are out here to get you if you decide to go for a dip in the sea. There are saltwater crocodiles that the locals call salties. Well, that's a cute nickname for such a dangerous reptile. And it's not just them. The wildlife seems to have a beef with visitors. From October to June, the waters around Cape Tribulation are full of box jellyfish. Their venom affects the human cardiovascular system. When touched by a jellyfish out at sea, swimmers won't have enough time to reach land for help. Vinegar helps neutralize the sting, so you might want to keep a spare bottle in your luggage. Crocodiles and jellyfish sound dangerous, but there's one more animal you should look after. It's the wild boar. It might sound funny, but you won't laugh when you're being chased by one of these across the beach. 21 million wild boars live in Australia. They're mostly active at night, making it even more dangerous if they charge at you. The best defense is running in circles. Wild boars can't cut corners well. That's probably why we don't see many of them taking up careers as race drivers. Cape Tribulation has one last danger installed for you, and it's not an animal. Out here, even the trees are plotting against visitors. The stinging tree got its name for a reason. If you try to pick one of its beautiful red berries, it'll fight back. Its prickles are like tiny glass shards. The less than pleasant effect on your skin will last for a month. Then there is this wait a while bush. Who keeps naming them like this? This long vine has spikes that grab hold and just don't let go. They are so strong they can pull a human off a horse. You'll have to wait for someone to come by and save you from this thorny grabber. If you are about to cross this Australian beach from the vacation list, hold on for a second. Tourism is booming here. The local authorities have restricted access to all of the danger zones. Visitors go swimming in dreamy water holes that are surrounded by lush vegetation. There are even ropes to swing from. Now, that's a beach you can finally relax on.
The movie Jaws came out in 1975, and since then, people have been terrified of sharks. Some people fear seeing a great white's head come out of their showers, not to mention the fear of running into one at your local pool. Of course, none of this is actually possible, but some other scary shark stuff is. Like, yes, sharks can attack boats. They probably won't sink one. It depends on the size of the shark and the size of the boat. Today, we're diving deep into the facts and myths about the sea's biggest predator. It was the year 1953. On a typical July morning, two fishers set out on their daily lobster harvest. They took their white-hulled dory out to sea off the coast of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, Canada. Since it was the lobster season, the sea was dotted with several dories spread out across the water. But that day, something strange happened. As soon as they put the dory at sea, they noticed a large dorsal fin chasing after their boat. They were surprised to see that the shark would follow their boat's every move. For an entire week, they took out their white dory from the harbor, and the shark followed them around. Until one morning, as the men were alone at sea, the shark charged at full speed at the boat and smashed a 7-inch hole in its bottom. The boat turned over, and both men fell into the water. The shark didn't come after the men, though. Instead, it swam away and disappeared for good. To clarify, a dory is a small, fragile boat usually measuring 16 to 23 feet long. So how long did that shark need to be in order to sink it? Well, as soon as the boat was retrieved from the ocean, researchers found something interesting. One of the shark's teeth was found stuck in the hull. According to Harvard experts that analyzed the tooth, it most certainly belonged to a 12-foot white shark that weighed around 1,200 pounds. One thing intrigues scientists a whole lot. The great white didn't seem to be interested in the men aboard, but rather in the boat itself. The question is, why? Some people suppose that this great white followed the dory around because it was white, and the animal probably thought it was some big white mammal. It's not the first boat a shark has attacked. You see, sharks don't attempt to sink boats because they're mean and evil. Rather, it's due to murky waters and hard materials that make them mistake inanimate objects for their usual lunch menu. But that's not what we've learned from popular culture. In Jaws, the protagonist shark managed to poke several holes in the orca as it rammed the boat. The orca was a Nova Scotia-style fishing boat made out of wood planks. It wasn't a huge boat, so it seemed plausible that a great white could ram it. But, according to Mythbusters, that's very far from the truth. A great white swimming at its maximum speed wouldn't be able to take down a medium-sized fishing vessel. The same goes for bigger boats. Some bull sharks or great whites can turn over smaller vessels, though, like kayaks or small boats. If this happens, it's most likely because they think it's a sea mammal and nudge it before taking the first bite. No scientist can say for sure why they do this, only that it's usually a misunderstanding on behalf of the animal. The Shark Research Committee, a nonprofit scientific research organization, has documented a lot of shark attacks on inanimate objects and is trying to answer that question more thoroughly. So far, they've observed several attacks on objects such as crab trap buoys and inflatable float bags. The website has also registered 2 famous attacks on boats. The first one happened in 1959, and a shark left a tooth on the hull of a boat. Researchers later identified it as belonging to a 12-foot great white. The report of the other attack, which happened in 1989, claims that a boat was circled by a great white before the animal swam at the vessel at full speed and hit the boat several times. Of course, those who suffer the most from shark attacks and encounters aren't boats. It's surfers. As far as we know, surfers look like giant wobbly seals from the shark's perspective. According to the Shark Research Committee, there have been 41 confirmed shark attacks on surfers on the west coast of North America over the course of the last century. So, should we be so afraid of sharks after all? Let's learn more about these magnificent sea creatures. Off the top of your head, how many shark species can you name? 4, 8, 10? Well, There are over 500 species of sharks swimming in the ocean. They vary from tiny specimens, about the size of a human hand, to up to 39-foot-long creatures. The largest species of shark are actually not great whites, but whale sharks. And even those are small compared to the great Megalodon. This ancient creature that lived around 20 million years ago reached an unimaginable length of 60 feet. By comparison, that's the same as 2 to 3 buses placed one after another. I wouldn't swim in megalodon-infested waters even if you dared me, that's for sure. We know that sharks are very good hunters, but why is that so? Their bodies seem to have been strategically built for speed. Instead of having a bone skeleton, like us humans, sharks have a cartilage skeleton, which makes them much lighter and also super fast swimmers. Each species of shark hunts depending on its nutritional needs. So, shark species that grow to an average of 3 feet have a diet based on fish. The ones that grow bigger start feeding off of bigger sea animals, such as sea lions and seals. Throughout their lives, some species of shark can shed over 30,000 teeth. Unlike humans, who are born with a set number of teeth in their jaws, sharks have an apparently limitless supply. In their defense, they do lose teeth pretty easily, as they can easily get stuck in their prey, for example. They also have multiple rows of teeth. The jaws of a great white can contain up to 7 rows of teeth, and can grow to be more than 6 inches long. And since we're speaking of great whites, the most feared shark species roaming the oceans, this is ray. Ray is an adult white shark. He can swim up to 50 miles a day, so he needs a lot of fat in order to keep his body functioning. Funny thing about Ray, when he opens his jaws to hunt, his eyes roll back together with his head, so his sight is hindered when he's taking a bite. Now, he does like it when the water is murky and underwater visibility is low. That's because it makes it harder for his prey to spot him coming. These conditions can make it easier for him to grab that yummy seal. But this can also make it easy for him to mistake a random boat for lunch and end up scaring some humans. Some Hollywood movies love to portray sharks as having superpowers. Although they're not innately cruel, one species of shark does have something that can be considered bizarre. Hammerhead sharks, one of the most dangerous species of sharks, have a sort of sixth sense. Inside their heads, they have electroreceptor organs called ampullae of Lorenzini. These organs allow sharks to detect the electromagnetic fields of all living things in the ocean. This ups their hunting abilities to another level. They can even find prey hidden in the sand because they sense its electromagnetic field. You should know one thing. If a shark lives in a balanced ecosystem, it won't feel the need to attack unknown things. These animals are curious, though, so maybe we should cut them some slack when they bite a piece off a random boat.
As an experienced sailor and the first man to ever sail non-stop on his own around North and South America, Matt Rutherford has seen a lot during his voyages. But what he saw in 2013 while sailing through the waters of the Atlantic with his colleague surely stands out. Some 800 miles off the coast of Bermuda, not far away from the famous Bermuda Triangle, they noticed a boat that seemed to be moving by itself. The sails weren't up and the motor wasn't running. The sailors decided to check if there was someone who needed their help aboard, so they moved closer to the mysterious ship. Once they got there, things only got weirder, as they realized there wasn't a living soul aboard. Rutherford started filming to document their discovery. The boat looked so awfully abandoned that they expected to find some pretty scary things in there. But it didn't stop Rutherford from searching the vessel. The boat, which turned out to be named Wolfhound, looked like an upscale one, probably costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was pretty weird to find it floating by itself in the middle of the ocean. It seemed like whoever abandoned it was leaving in a rush. There were clothes and other personal belongings all over the main cabin. Some parts of the ceiling had fallen and some drawers had popped open. The brave sailors decided to tow the ghost ship back to Bermuda. It wasn't easy because Wolfhound was bigger and heavier than their boat. After days at sea, the crew was running low on fuel and asked a passing freighter to stop and give them some gas. They kept pulling Wolfhound until the tow line got wrapped around the rudder and they realized they could get stranded in the Bermuda Triangle. So they had to abandon the ship. What really happened and how Wolfhound ended up in the middle of the ocean will probably remain a mystery. Rumor has it that it belonged to a member of the Royal Irish Yacht Club. The ship was going on its first voyage from Connecticut to Bermuda and then Antigua. It got in a terrible storm around 400 miles away from Delaware. The winds were so strong that the yacht suffered 2 knockdowns. A Greek cargo ship rescued the crew. They left the ship with an emergency beacon on. The rescued crew members shared that they saw the ship sink, which only adds more questions to the story. How did it get back to the surface? Does the Bermuda Triangle have anything to do with that? Christopher Columbus himself reported some unusual compass activity going on in this mysterious area while he was on his way to the New World. Despite the stories of more than 50 ships and 20 planes disappearing in the area, it remains one of the most heavily traveled shipping routes in the world. Some skeptics believe that this fact solves the Bermuda Triangle mystery. It could make sense because the busier the area, the more accidents happen there. But then again, it's not the number of disappearances that makes the place so mysterious. It's the lack of explanation and wreckage lost for good. The first ever confirmed ship to vanish in the Bermuda Triangle was the USS Pickering. In 1800, it departed from the US on its way to the West Indies. The ship sailed into the Bermuda Triangle along with its 90-man crew. No one ever heard anything from them ever since. The popular explanation is that the ship was taken out by a storm. But because no one found any wreckage, we'll never know for sure. The largest ship that has ever disappeared in this mysterious area was the USS Cyclops. In March 1918, carrying a crew of 306 people, the USS Cyclops left Barbados and headed home to Baltimore. The ship passed through the Bermuda Triangle on its journey and vanished into thin air, or rather, water. The Cyclops never sent any distress signal and disappeared without any explanation or trace. The Bermuda Triangle isn't the only place in the world where ships go missing or mysteriously resurface. One of the most famous ghost ship stories would be of SS Beijimo. The large cargo steamer was built in Sweden. On October 1st, 1931, it got caught in pack ice. The crew decided to wait it out and managed to break free after a couple of days, only to get trapped again in less than a week. This time, they didn't manage to make it out. A rescue team went by air to save 22 of the crew members. 15 other members stayed in a wooden shelter they built not far away from the ship. Their plan was to wait out the winter and get back aboard. At the end of November, a strong blizzard was rushing through the area. When it was over, Beijimo seemed to have gone away with the storm. The captain decided it must have broken and sunk. But a few days later, a local hunter informed them that he had seen the ship around 45 miles away from their camp. The crew managed to find the ship and took the most valuable cargo from its hold. They had fears that Beijimo wouldn't live through that rough water, but it did manage to survive after all. Once the ice was gone, it floated away and ended up drifting along the shores of Canada and Alaska. Many people reported seeing the ghost ship in an open sea. Some even tried to board it to save the ship, but the weather didn't allow it to happen. The last time someone saw SS Bechimo was in 1969, 38 years after its crew had left it. It could still be drifting somewhere in the ocean. The story of MV Hoita happened in the South Pacific. The ship was originally a wooden luxury yacht. After serving for 20 years to various owners, it became a merchant ship. In 1959, it set on a trading voyage that was supposed to last around 2 days. When it didn't reach its destination on time, no one was worried at first, as things happen in the open waters. After another day, and no distress signals from the Hoita, it was obvious that something serious was going on with it. There were 25 people aboard, and their families wanted to find them. A search and rescue crew worked for 6 days looking for the ship, or at least its wreckage, in an area of nearly 100,000 square miles. That's 1.5 times as big as Florida. Sadly, the mission had come back with no results. It seemed like Hoita had disappeared without a trace. A month later, another merchant ship noticed Hoita drifting in the ocean, miles and miles away from its original route, and none of the crew members or passengers were on board. The cargo had also disappeared. The lifeboats were also gone, so the people must have escaped the ship hoping to save themselves. It turned out that the crew had been trying to get help as they tuned the radio to the International Distress Channel. But the damaged cable didn't let them send the signal any further than 2 miles. It also looked like when they were leaving the ship, the crew took the logbook with them, and we still don't know what exactly happened to Hoita. Family members of those who were on board are still looking for answers. One professor claims it must have been a corroded pipe that leaked and flooded the vessel, but we'll most likely never know for sure. In the Pacific Ocean, near Japan, there is an area nicknamed the Devil's Sea. It's believed to be one of the 12 vile vortices around the Earth. Some people claim that vile vortices have weird things going on in them because the pull of the planet's electromagnetic waves is stronger there than anywhere else. The most famous ship that disappeared in the area was a fishery patrol vessel in 1952. The ship went there to investigate the vessels that went missing previously and disappeared along with 31 crew members. Scientists who don't believe it was a mysterious disappearance blame the underwater volcano eruption for what happened. More than 25 million people boarded cruise ships globally back in 2017. It may not seem like a lot, but that's more than the total population of Belgium. It's a great vacation alternative with an added bonus. You can sample various different destinations for future time off in one single trip. If you've already booked a trip on a cruise ship, but you still have no idea what you should pack, start with some research on your specific cruise location. Either way, be sure to bring deck-friendly shoes that are low-heeled. Also, add a pair that's comfortable to walk on larger distances for the days spent ashore. Depending on the season, you might want to add a few swimsuits too. If you're on any type of medication, make sure you bring it with you in its original packaging. If you're a light packer, don't worry. Most cruise ships come equipped with laundry rooms. They're kind of pricey, especially if you want your garments to be washed, ironed, and folded for you. But it does save you the extra hassle of packing more clothes or washing them for yourself. It's really important that you check in with your credit card company before boarding a ship, more so if your itinerary includes one or more foreign countries. Your credit card might get frozen if there's any unusual activity on your account. Most of these companies have algorithms that get triggered once there are charges from different countries in rapid succession, which is exactly what you'll be doing on a cruise ship. Letting them know beforehand saves you the embarrassment of having your card declined at some fancy restaurant. To make sure you get the best room, before booking it, check out the ship's deck plan. It should be available on their website. If it's peace and tranquility you're looking for, don't go for the rooms directly above or below any of the ship's entertainment points. Also, if you have a history of getting seasick, try to skip the rooms that are available at the front of the ship. Rather, go for those located in the middle of the ship on a lower deck. You'll feel less movement. If it's your first time going on a cruise, you might be surprised to know that some cabin rooms don't have windows. Before making a reservation, make sure to check out all the amenities of the room you intend to book. Most cruise liners add a bunch of pictures from the common rooms on their reservation pages, and it might be a bit confusing as to what you're getting exactly for that specific price point. Also, some rooms on board are quite small too. If you don't like to sleep in small spaces, you might want to upgrade to a larger room, even if it's a bit pricier. You can always split the cost with a friend if they want to join you on the cruise. With the help of modern technology, even if a specific location doesn't have windows, it doesn't mean you can't watch the waves. How, you might ask? Fancier cruise ships feature a secret, added bonus. In the areas with no access to sunlight, specialists have built virtual balconies. These high-tech screens work by showing you what's going on outside in real time. They have an added benefit too. In case of bad weather, guests can still have a feel of the outdoors, without the wind or rain ruining their hair or their outfit. It may not be the real deal, but it still beats getting claustrophobic on board. Planning on going on a budget cruise? It might not be such a bad idea, especially if you're on the lookout for last-minute upgrades. You might even end up vacationing like a millionaire without having to spend money like one. These upgrades sometimes include things like a private balcony in your room, maybe some spa services, or even better prices for high-end meals. If they aren't all booked by the time people board the ship, they might be open for the rest of the passengers for way better prices than initially listed. There might be hidden freebies on board if you pay close attention. Things like complimentary pastries on board late in the morning or a late-night cup of tea on the house might be some of the things offered to guests. You only need to ask. You might want to check out what other tourists are doing. Some people with more experience cruising can offer pretty great tips and tricks. Don't be afraid to start a conversation if you see someone getting something for free. Some cruise ships do go all the way on the fancy dial. They even have exclusive areas designed for guests staying in expensive suites. Most of the time, they're located at the top of the ship. On one particular cruise, these types of guests have designated staff members called Royal Genies, which are similar to butlers. They can cater to just a few cabins. Since the cruise line wants to divert other guests from asking them various questions, which will take time away from their assigned guests, the genies do not wear a name tag in public areas. Most common areas of cruise ships do require travelers to follow a dress code, but if you do your research in advance, you might find that some areas are more relaxed when it comes to what people need to wear. Most cruise ships require people to adhere to smart attire, which means pants with a collared shirt for men, or blouses and skirts, dresses, or stylish pants for the ladies. As for the travel destinations, be sure to research the ports you're about to visit in advance. You'll know what to wear, what the weather will be, and if you need to pack anything else, like an umbrella or a beach towel. Stops on cruises only last for a few hours in most cases, so you'll want to get the most out of them. If that specific location includes museums or art galleries you want to add to your checklist, be sure to book in advance so you don't waste time waiting in lines. Some cruise ships even provide their guests with private tours of the ports they're about to visit. Do make sure to book them in advance if this is something you might be interested in, as the list gets pretty full quite fast. Independent tours are a bit more private. You can spend time with your tour guide and even ask more questions. Always remember to put your phone in airplane mode while on board. Most cruise ship horror stories involve cruising newbies that ended up paying thousands of dollars in cell phone charges while on ships, just because they forgot to turn it off. If you're the type of person that can't switch off their phone, be sure to check with your cell phone provider before traveling internationally. Some can provide special plans for limited amounts of time, without extra charges. You'll be free to chat, Call or browse YouTube videos without worrying you'll end up paying a fortune. Most cruise ships also provide you with complimentary Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi packages that can be purchased in advance, which are way more affordable. You can stick to communicating with your friends and family back home via FaceTime or Skype. People that have heard about the Titanic tragedy will always wonder what might happen if something goes wrong while on board. Let's take lifeboats, for instance. The Titanic had a mere 20 lifeboats on board, which were tragically not enough to fit all the passengers after the ship hit the iceberg. Some fancy cruise ships these days have an even lower number of lifeboats, anywhere from 15 to 18. Sounds strange? Well, not really, given the fact that each lifeboat can accommodate up to 370 people. Even the largest ships, which have an estimated capacity of 8,000 people if fully booked, including tourists and staff, are safe in case of an emergency. Have you ever wondered how containers on a cargo ship remain intact throughout the whole journey? Let me answer this question and tell you about other cool ship facts. Meet Unsinkable Sam. Sam's goal was to prove the saying, "Cats have 9 lives." This animal survived 3 ships sinking. He was originally named Oscar, but got nicknamed Unsinkable Sam. You probably get why. The first time the ship he was traveling on sank, Oscar was found by the crew of another ship when he was floating on board. He remained on that ship for a couple of months, but then the vessel also sank in 1941. The cat was then saved by another ship. The crew there had heard the story of the animal and called him Unsinkable Sam. His marine journey ended when the crew sent him back to the UK. The story checks out, but some people question whether it's true. Sailors had to spend months on their ships, so it was natural that they told strange stories or believed in superstitions. One thing is clear though, sailors loved cats and welcomed them on their ships. Besides being cute floofs, cats were very effective in terms of hunting rodents. You can take it as you wish, a hoax or a true story. I'm leaving Sam in the 40s and returning to the present day. How come ships have internet in the middle of nowhere? Since there are no towers or cables around, satellite connection steps in. Satellite services provide direct internet connection via hardware installed on the ship. This hardware is a must. It's not as cheap as our home Wi-Fi. The installation charges for the entire ship's internet are around $600. And the price of the hardware depends on such things as the size of the ship and how much internet it's going to use. This is not the only option. Wireless devices are also popular, yet they can access the internet only when they're close to ports or other places where networks are available. The Titanic was a giant luxurious hotel for some of its passengers. You may have heard that it had lots of amenities you could use, even its own newspaper. Yep, it was called the Atlantic Daily Bulletin. It was published on the ship. The paper had news articles, advertisements, and the latest stock prices. It also mentions daily menus, horse racing results, and society gossip. Where ships get fuel is also a good question. There aren't fuel stations floating in the ocean. Bunkering is the answer. Ships use different kinds of oil for different purposes. Bunkering is loading fuel onto a ship. This process takes place at ports. The storage and provision of the ship fuels can be made by tankers. Currently, Singapore is the largest bunkering port in the world. Imagine you're on a cruise ship and you need to use the toilet. What happens after you flush? The sewage goes to a place called an onboard treatment plant. There, the waste is filtered. Then it moves to another chamber. This chamber cleans the waste and sterilizes it. Lastly, the waste is dumped into the ocean when it's clean enough. Those substances that don't go through the filter are kept on the ship. A ship gets rid of them when it arrives at a port. Speaking of toilets, I must mention that wastewater is color-coded on cruise ships. Every person on a cruise uses 40 to 50 gallons of water each day. That's why there might be too much wastewater. So, over the years, some solutions have been found to reduce this amount. water is coded as black and gray. Black water goes from toilets, and gray water comes from the laundry, showers, kitchens, etc. Basically, it's thought that gray water waste is cleaner than black water. Why are ships so slow? It's related to power. Water has a drag force, and it affects ships. Imagine yourself swimming in the ocean. It takes effort to swim forward because of the water resistance. A smaller ship wouldn't need that much power to push itself forward, but huge cruise ships need a lot of power because they're heavier. If you, let's say, put a 7,000-ton ship in the water, it will displace 7,000 tons of water. When such a ship goes forward, it pushes some of the displaced water ahead of itself. This results in a bow wave, which carries some kinetic energy away. We talked about cruise ships and cargo ships mainly. What about solo travelers? Laura Decker became the youngest person to circumnavigate the world on her own. She set out in 2012, and 518 days later, she completed her voyage. She had a 40-foot-long ketch named Guppy. She was 14 when she started the journey. You can think of loading containers on a cargo ship as playing Tetris, but you can't start over when the game is over. That would cost you thousands of dollars. Anyway, the logic is the same. The first layer should be strong enough to support the rest. The bottom containers, or first tier, if you want to sound more like a pro, are secured with twist locks. This is an automatic locking mechanism to keep the upper level containers locked. These locks are attached when a unit is being lifted from the pier onto a cargo ship. They're similar to Lego pins. All containers have these lock systems, and you basically mount them on top of each other. Plus, many cargo ships have vertical slots made of long metal rails. They're like cells that hold containers and prevent them from moving and falling into the deep water. How do they unlock the mechanism? There's a special rod to do it. In the past, cargo ships were allowed to only stack 5 to 6 containers on top of one another. With the appearance of the lock mechanism, it's possible to make 10 to 12 layers. Still, hundreds of containers get lost each year because of harsh weather conditions, or simply because of the negligence of people who load them. According to some data, more than 3,100 containers were lost in 2020 to 2021. The number was only 779 in the previous year. This means an almost 400% increase. Apparently, there are hidden passageways and secret doors on cruise ships. The ship's staff get from one place to another without using the stairs and doors that passengers use. There's a network of corridors and stairs all around the ship only the crew members know about. These secret doors can blend in with the walls. This way, they become undetected by those who don't know there's a door there. Gigantic cruise ships are basically floating pieces of metal. The walls of the cruise ship cabins are magnetic. That's why, when on a cruise, you can buy travel-themed fridge magnets and use them to decorate your cabin. The Seawise Giant is the largest ship in history. It was built between 1974 and 1979. Its length was greater than the height of the Eiffel Tower. The vessel sunk in 1988, but was later retrieved and put into service. What about the smallest ship in the world? Researchers in the Netherlands have built the world's smallest vessel. It's about 1/100th of an inch long. To put it in perspective, this is about 1/3 the width of a strand of your hair. They built it with the help of a 3D printer. Do you know that some people have residences on ships? Yes, sounds like a dream, if you like the water, of course. Residents permanently live on a ship as it travels the world. MS The World is an example of a private residential cruise ship. The residents can live on board as the liner travels to exotic destinations. They can stay there full-time or come back periodically during the year. Since the UK is an island nation, things it imports have to be delivered by sea or by cargo planes. The number might surprise you. 90% of everything they buy arrives at their ports by sea. Do you know any other cool marine facts? Comment below.
Ships have been around for at least 6,000 years, dating back to ancient Egypt. I wasn't around then. In the beginning, they were used for business purposes only, mostly trading and exploring. Ships as an attraction only became a thing a bit over 100 years ago. You might think it was the infamous Titanic, but you'd be wrong. The first cruise ship that took passengers on a voyage was a German ship called Prinzessin Victoria Luisa. It was launched in 1900 and served for 6 years. Of course, now they are more advanced and last longer, around 30 years. After that use-by date, it's no longer safe to travel due to metal fatigue, most often of the ship's hull. So, since ships don't have too long of a lifespan, it makes sense to build them big. I mean big, so they can accommodate as many passengers as possible. Your average cruise ship is 1,000 feet in length, or approximately 3 times as big as a football field. They're also tall enough to require elevators. They're also filled with different facilities, like restaurants, pools, and many other fun activities. Right now, the biggest cruise ship in the world is called Wonder of the Seas. It's 1,187 feet long, has 18 decks, and can host almost 7,000 non-crew passengers. It has 8 different neighborhoods, 20 restaurants, 4 pools, a water park, a full-size basketball court, an ice skating rink, rock climbing walls, and even a theater. So it's basically a floating city. Some people are permanent cruise ship residents. There's a luxury ocean liner called the World that offers permanent residence to 165 people. These people sail almost every day and never live in one place. So yes, cruise ships are enormous, and if you build them at once, they won't fit anywhere. So the ship is constructed part by part, prefab, often by different companies. Cruise cabins are built separately, and then they're added to the ship at the shipyard. Such huge ships sure have big anchors. An average anchor weighs like 4 grown elephants. The crew members try to avoid dropping the anchor when possible because such a massive thing can severely harm the ecosystems at the bottom of the sea. With around 2,000 cabins on average, it's impossible to ensure that every cabin has a window for the voyagers to observe the sea. So cruise ships found a solution. Interior cabins that don't have windows have virtual balconies that transmit real-life images from the outside of the ship, depending on where your cabin is located. Even if you get a cabin with a virtual balcony, you still have better accommodations than the crew members. They reside in a so-called B deck, which is located in the lower part of the ship below the waterline. There are dorm-style rooms with a bunch of bunk beds and lockers. Also, crew members have a secret language, code words that they use to exchange information without the passengers knowing. For example, the word Alpha or Star code signals a medical emergency. And Bravo, Bravo, Bravo means a fire on the ship. By the way, there's a bunch of stuff you aren't allowed to take on board because of potential threats. Those include candles, clothes irons, travel steamers, and hot plates. Basically, it's anything that produces flame or heat, with the only exception of curling irons and hair straighteners. Yeah, I never leave home without mine. Since people live on board for weeks, and often the ships spend days in the open sea, you can imagine that a lot of waste is produced every day from the thousands of passengers and crew the ship is hosting. So, where does it all go? Well, dumping trash in the sea or ocean is illegal. So, the ship engineers devised a system. On a particular crew-only deck of a ship, there's a recycling station where all the waste goes from everywhere around the ship. Everything that can be recycled, paper, aluminum cans, all types of glass, and plastic bottles are collected, separated, crushed, and stored until the ship docks at a port and can send the stack to a recycling station. As for the food waste, all kitchens on board have a suction drain, which takes the food to one big pipe, which takes all of it to a hydroprocessor. The processor crushes the food into small pieces and then burns it. Now, the cruising capital of the world is Miami, Florida. Having 5 ports, Florida is the place where most cruise ships depart. Voyages are fun, but if you need to get somewhere fast, cruise ships shouldn't be your first choice, because they're slow. On average, they travel at the speed of 20 knots, which is just 23 miles per hour. Ships travel much slower than cars and planes because they move huge amounts of water. For instance, when you run on the ground, you're fast. No, really, I've seen you. Now step in a swimming pool and try to run there. It'll be way harder for you to do, and you'll be way slower, barely moving through. Now keep in mind that you're much smaller than a ship. As we've seen, ships are big boys. When you put something in the water, it displaces the amount of water that is equivalent to its weight. So, a ship displaces thousands of tons of water and then pushes through it, creating such a drag. That's why they're slow. Still, in a year, cruise ships sail around the equivalent of 3 times around the planet. Apparently, the passengers are there to enjoy the ride and not so much the velocity. Obviously, such ships need a boatload of fuel. And not just one, several types are required. Heavy fuel oil is used for the main engines, marine diesel is needed for smaller engines and lifeboats, and there's also marine gas oil for the turbines. Every day, each cruise ship burns, on average, 150 tons of fuel and releases exhaust equal to 1 million cars combined. So there are often regulations regarding how pure each type of fuel must be. In most parts of the world, ships can only use fuel that contains no more than 0.5% of sulfur, a component that highly contributes to air pollution. In other countries, the fuel must be even purer, containing only 0.1% of sulfur. The cleaner the fuel, the more expensive it is. So ships often change from one fuel grade to another, depending on the area the ship is sailing in. So, where do ships get so much of the stuff? Apparently, there are floating filling stations, so-called product tankers. They carry different grades of fuel and deliver it to the ship, connecting to the ship's fuel tanks and pumping the proper grade of oil into the section where it's needed. All cruise ships pick up stranded sailors and fishermen, and that happens quite often. So don't be surprised if your cruise ship stops in the middle of the sea to pick someone up. It's a common practice. Ships can even change course to pick up some stranded sailors if they get a distress call. But what happens if you, a passenger, falls over? You clumsy oaf. Hey, just kidding. Ships have sensors that should notice the accident and send a distress signal, but witnesses are still important. The person will be saved way faster. So, if you ever see someone falling overboard, here's what to do. Throw them a life ring, point at them and scream, "A person overboard!" and get someone to tell the ship's bridge. If no one is around, do everything it takes to get some attention. You can call the ship's emergency number or even activate one of the alarms. Afterward, it's up to the crew to do the rescue operation. By the way, crew members have a code phrase for a person overboard too. It's Oscar, Oscar, Oscar. And that's not for Oscar Mayer. It's a code unique to the Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. Ever since What Happened to the Titanic, remember the Oscar-winning movie? Every cruise ship is obligated to have safety equipment to accommodate 125% of the people on board, so you shouldn't be scared of history repeating itself, especially in the warm tropic islands. After around 30 years, when a ship has served its time, it retires and gets sent to a shipyard where it gets scrapped. Many famous and beloved ships enjoy a better fate. They get turned into hotels and attractions. Yes, it's good to be the queen.
Ships have been around for at least 6,000 years, dating back to ancient Egypt. In the beginning, they were used for trading and exploring. Ships as an attraction became a thing only a bit over 100 years ago, but the first cruise ship wasn't the infamous Titanic as you might think. The first cruise ship that took passengers on a voyage was a German ship called Prinzessin Victoria Louise back in 1900, and it served for 6 years. Modern ships are of course more advanced, but they still have a limited lifespan. They usually serve for about 30 years. A ship much older than that isn't considered safe and stable anymore due to the metal fatigue, most often of the ship's hull. After ships finish their lifespan, they retire and get sent to a shipyard, where they get scrapped. Most famous and beloved ships have a better fate. They get turned into hotels and attractions. Since ships are extremely expensive to build, no wonder that they are so huge, often as long as 3 football fields and as tall as 20-story building. The companies want to accommodate as many passengers as possible, because it means better profits. Also, cruise ship cabins are built separately from the ship, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough space for the construction. They're added to the vessel already in the shipyard, where the ship is put together. Quite often, different parts of the ship are even built by different companies. Voyages are fun, but if you need to get somewhere fast, cruise ships shouldn't be your first choice, because they are very slow. On average, they travel at the speed of just 23 miles per hour. Ships travel way slower than cars and planes, because they move huge amounts of water. Move on the ground and you're fast. Now step in a swimming pool and try to run there. It'll be way harder for you to do, and you'll be way slower, barely moving through. Now keep in mind that you are much smaller than a ship. As we've seen, ships are massive. When you put something in the water, it displaces the amount of water that is equivalent to its weight. So a ship displaces thousands of tons of water and then pushes through it. That's why they are slow. Such huge ships sure have big anchors. An average anchor weighs like 4 grown-up elephants. The crew members try to avoid dropping the anchor when it's possible, because such a massive thing can severely harm the ecosystems at the bottom of the sea. When boarding a ship, the first thing we have to notice is lifeboats. The Titanic was designed to carry 64 lifeboats, but it only had 20 of them. The rest is history, but ever since what happened to the Titanic, ships are required to have safety equipment to accommodate 125% of the people on the ship. So, it's even more than required, just to be on a safe side. But here is the story. In 1915, 3 years after the Titanic sank, a cruise ship called SS Eastland, which was loaded with extra lifeboats and rafts, sank under the heavy weight of all that extra equipment. But don't worry, it never happened again. Even though modern cruise ships are very safe, it's good to be prepared. So let's take a look inside one of those lifeboats. Firstly, they are orange in color, and it's not just some orange. This one has a special name, International Bright Orange. Of course, there is a good reason to use it, better visibility. If we take a look at the color wheel, orange is the exact opposite of blue, meaning that it's most contrasting to it. So, in between the sea and the sky, which usually appear blue, an orange boat will be the most visible. Life jackets and life preservers are orange for the same reason, as you might have guessed. But International Bright Orange only became a requirement in 1962. Before that, the life jackets were mostly white. For example, look at those life jackets. These are the ones that were used by the passengers on the Titanic. But white isn't a good choice at all. It's particularly hard to spot a white life jacket and a white lifeboat on a white-capped sea. All the equipment inside the lifeboats must meet international requirements and must be kept in good condition. So, the crew members are required to do maintenance every 3 months to avoid any rupture and damage of the lifeboats and everything in them. Firstly, there is a fresh water and food ration, for obvious reasons. Then there is a portable compass, which helps determine the direction in which to steer it. The next thing is a signaling mirror. It's a device that allows the light to attract the attention of passing ships. A less expected thing inside is an embarkation ladder, a rope ladder with wooden or metal steps that are used to ascend or descend from one ship to another. And finally, there is a first aid kit. All cruise ships pick up stranded sailors and fishermen, and that happens quite often. So don't be surprised if your cruise ship stops in the middle of the sea to pick someone up. It's common practice. Ships can even change their course to pick up some stranded sailors if they get a distress call. Have you noticed that all ships, both cruise ships and container ships, always have the bottom of the hull painted red? Yes, it's a thing. In early times, when ships were mostly made of wood, sailors were painting the hulls with copper paint because it was protecting the vessel from wood-eating worms, barnacles, and seaweed. The copper was the ingredient that was giving the paint that color. All this muck wasn't only impairing the vessel's structure, but was also increasing the drag, preventing the ships from moving as fast as they could have. So, protective paint is important to reduce the number of barnacles that get accumulated. These days, of course, hull-protecting ingredients can be added to any kind of paint, and there is no practical need to paint the bottom of the hull red, but it's still being done to honor the old tradition. Still, even the most modern paint doesn't allow to completely avoid the growth of barnacles on the hull. Also, most ports don't even allow you to scrape those off the hull once you dock. That's because the ships that arrive from faraway waters can bring along non-native species of seaweed and other organisms which can severely harm the local ecosystem. Crew members sleep in that lower part of the ship, the underwater one. It's called a B-deck, and there are dorm-style rooms in the hull just for the crew members. Also, you might have noticed that there are numbers painted vertically on the side of the hull. The red background helps them stand out more, which is important since those numbers are crucial. They help you understand how much load the ship is carrying. The more weight there is on board, the lower in the water the vessel will sit. If you watched movies about pirates or heard sailors talk, you might have noticed that the ships are referred to as she and often have female names. It is an old tradition to consider a ship as a female figure, most often a mother or a female deity that is guiding and protecting the crew. It is also believed that the name of the ship brings good luck to the ship, as well as to the crew and the passengers. People who spend their lives in the sea have many superstitions regarding boats. Finding a cat aboard is considered good luck, even if the cat is black. They are very handy because they hunt mice, therefore keeping the ship clean and safe. But bananas aboard is a no-no. It's especially common among fishermen. They believe that if there are bananas in the boat, the fish won't.
The year was 1854, and the SS Arctic, the fastest passenger liner of its time, set out to cross the Atlantic. As it sailed through the misty veil, it slowly disappeared into the unknown. The Collins Line, an American shipping company, was started in 1818 and only began seriously trading in the transatlantic by 1835. Its steamships crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool to New York within just 10 days. Doesn't sound like a great speed today, I know, but back then, the same thing took other ships several weeks. Light on the water with their wooden hulls, powering through with a strong steam engine, those steamships were the favorite choice for many high-profile people. What could go wrong with such an advanced ship, they thought. This reminds me of some other ship everyone believed to be unsinkable. But anyway, back to the Collins Line. It grew to be a serious contender on transatlantic routes, with only one other competitor, the Cunard's Line. It was a British company also aiming to be the main force through the Arctic Passage. In 1835, the company received a new ship that traveled to Liverpool and came back to New York with the largest cargo ever at that time. From then, the Collins Line was steadily growing. It seemed like there would only be future successes for it. Unfortunately, their lavish ships became costly to run with the amount of coal used. Massive power along with weak wooden hulls meant they needed many repairs after each voyage. So, every trip ended up being expensive. But since the ships were safe and had a great reputation, people were willing to pay the price, and the company was definitely not in crisis. They had achieved something no one had managed to do before them. Like I told you, their ships crossed the Atlantic in a whopping 10 days, and Edward Collins, the owner, was very determined to maintain the pace. Their 5 ships easily outran the Cunard's line of only 3. With this great praise, it provided more attention. Though the Cunard's ships were slower with their iron hulls, they believed there was still profit, regardless of how slowly they sailed. Among Collins' ships, the Arctic, the third of them to be launched, was the largest, reaching 284 feet long, with 2 side-lever steam engines, each with 1,000 horsepower. The paddle wheels made 16 revolutions a minute when at full speed. At the time of its launch, the press called it the most stupendous vessel ever constructed in the United States. But glamour and fame couldn't avoid what would come next. On the 27th of September, the Arctic was on its journey from Liverpool to New York, continuing a speed pace through the thick fog. It's possible that by that moment, after 4 years of record-breaking trips, the crew became overconfident with their sailing and the ship. Going only 50 miles from Newfoundland, they carelessly continued through the fog with no radio contact, sonar, or any other form of identifying objects, equipped only with Morse code. A smaller ship, the SS Vesta, which operated as a fishing vessel, often worked around Newfoundland. It was passing through the same path as the Arctic and crashed into its side. Shocked by the collision, the captain of the Arctic offered help to the much smaller Vesta, but it was soon clear that the damage that seemed minor on the Arctic was far worse. Beneath the waterline, a hole was letting water into the hull. The cost of the much faster wooden hull now seemed less valuable. They steered toward land, trying to plug the holes, but they weren't doing so well, and the seawater continued to pour in, filling up higher and pushing the ship down. And finally, once the engine room was full, it put out the boilers, taking away the massive power the Arctic was once legendary for. They moved slowly until coming to a complete stop. The ship continued to sink, and the order was to abandon it. At the time, maritime law allowed for the Arctic to carry only 6 lifeboats, only capable of saving 180 people. The crew and some of the passengers managed to push their way aboard and took most of the seats on those boats. Things were pretty wild, and everyone forgot about their manners, not letting the ladies and the youngest ones board first. It took 4 hours for the Arctic to sink. 150 crew and 250 passengers were on board. Those that weren't able to find a lifeboat made a desperate attempt to build their own rafts from parts of the ship. 2 days later, only 3 boats made it safely to the shore. The other 3 were never found. Believe it or not, the rescue party also saved some people that had been clinging to the wreckage for 2 days. Unlike the crew, the captain went down with the Arctic, but amazingly survived. He would be only one of 85 people that made it, out of the 400 on board. When the news arrived 2 weeks later, the public responded with great sadness to the losses. Great anger soon followed towards the poor safety measures in the crew. The press published demands to change the laws for more lifeboats. It only made sense to have enough for every person on board a ship. But they ignored those requests. This neglect would lead to more disasters in the future. Enough lifeboats would only come into maritime law some 60 years later, after the disaster of the Titanic. Edward Collins' wife and 2 children were also aboard the ship and didn't return. He was heartbroken, but didn't stop running his business. The Collins line still had a reputation to uphold, the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious on the Atlantic. Edward Collins would now build an even better ship than any other. It was named the Adriatic, and it was the largest ship in the world, 354 feet long. With 2 alternating steam engines that had never been built of this size. These steam engines at the time were at the height of engineering, though today you can only see them in models and toys. With the new addition of 2 masts, the Adriatic would also be able to sail if needed. Luckily, they made some lessons from the disaster of the Arctic. But before their new ship, the Adriatic, was built, another disaster had occurred. The sister ship of the Arctic had also sunk. They believed this second ship was desperate to stay in front of the Cunard's line and hit an iceberg somewhere during the race. This weird contest took the lives of 141 people. The desperation of Collins and his weakly built hulls pushed the company towards bankruptcy in 1858. The newly built Adriatic, costing over $1 million, had only made one voyage in the end. And even that voyage was considered a disaster. The ship collided with a tugboat. It still managed to finish its maiden voyage at a suitable time. After the company had gone bankrupt, they had to sell the ship for only $50,000. They removed the great giant engines, replacing them with only sails. Although it was once the greatest ship on the high seas, it was only 30 years later until it was abandoned, labeled irreparable, and anchored in a river. The other remaining ships were also sold and only used for parts. Edward Collins left the industry altogether, seeking work on dry land instead. As the Collins line was no longer in the mix, the Cunards would grow in strength. Without competition, they would win the Blue Riband for the next 30 years, and 180 years later, after producing hundreds of ships. They still have a constant presence on the seas as they provide transatlantic crossings, world voyages, and leisure cruises. To this day, the Cunard Line is the only one to run ships between Europe and America, and it's great proof that it's not always the fastest that's the best. It's 2018. You get up early in the morning to go ashore and catch some fish. You come to the spot you were yesterday, throw the hook into the sea, and wait. The float is twitching. You've caught some fish, but hey, hello? Why aren't you doing anything? Right now, you don't care about the fish. You're looking at something in the distance. You open your mouth in surprise since you see a huge ship stuck on a shoal. It wasn't here yesterday, so it got here at night. Okay, it'll probably sail away sooner or later. You fish for a few more hours. During this time, you observe the ship and notice no movement there. Is it empty? Boats and the Coastal Service are sailing from the shore to the vessel. You decide to check it out too. You get in your old boat and go there. The mist descends to the water, making the ship look creepy. The colossal vessel is rusty and empty. But where is the whole crew? And how did it get there? The Coast Guard comes on board. They search the hold, the cabins, and the upper deck. There's someone's stuff, some remnants of food supplies, notebooks, and clothes. Everything suggests the crew has disappeared for some reason. Fishers who noticed the vessel first didn't see anyone coming down from the board. No radio signals were sent to the port, and no one reported about the ship. It appeared here from nowhere. The only chance to get any information is to look at the number and name of the vessel. This is Sam Ratulangi, PB 1600. The Coast Guard checks the information, studies the data of all the country's ships, and no way. One company built the boat in 2001 in Indonesia. People used it to transport heavy loads across the seas around Asia. The ship had been properly operating for 8 years. People were delivering industrial goods to different points in the region, but something went wrong. In 2009, Sam Ratulangi was sailing near the coast of Taiwan, and that's it. There were no further records about it. There were no reports in any port. Everyone thought it must have drowned, so no one had been looking for it for years. And then, 9 years later, it appears here, big and rusty, off the coast of Myanmar, without sailors, without fuel. An investigation starts. City services are trying to find out the names of all the sailors working on the ship and find clues that would lead to solving this mystery. They also hope the ship owner will appear soon. They find 2 tow ropes on board. This means that some other ship towed Sam Ratulangi to this place. Then they identify and find 13 crew members. These people say they wanted to reach the factory in Bangladesh to repair Samratulangi. Another vessel helped tow the ship, but then 2 cables tore off, and a storm began. No one wanted to stay on board during such weather, so the crew members left it. No one knows what the ship has been doing for the last 9 years, and how it was possible without people on board. And here's another, much more mysterious ship story. On February 16, 2020, locals found a large cargo ship stuck on a rocky shore off the coast of an Irish village. The boat looked rusty, with holes in the hull and rotten parts. People hadn't seen this vessel the day before, so it appeared there at night. The last time people saw the Alta cargo ship was a few months earlier, thousands of miles off the coast of Ireland. That day, the Alta was sailing in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Another ship, the MS Protector, noticed it. MS Protector crew members tried to contact the ship, but received no response. The people on board realized that they were facing an empty vessel. And then, 5 months later, it appeared near the coast of Ireland. There are more questions than answers in this story, but we managed to find something out. In 2015, the Alta appeared and disappeared from the radar several times. Any ship has an internal tracking system, so people can track its route using satellites. But Alta crew members often disabled this system. Perhaps they were engaged in some illegal activity. Anyway, in 2017, the ship often sailed between the ports of Greek islands. Then, the tracking signal disappeared and appeared only 10 months later, off the coast of North Africa. During this time, the ship changed several flags. In September 2018, the Alta was southeast of Bermuda and headed for Haiti. Then, the crew started facing problems. First, the main engine failed right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The ship began to drift. Several days passed, but the crew members weren't able to repair it. They began to run out of food and water supplies. The situation got even worse when they found out that a hurricane was approaching the place. Fortunately, they managed to contact the U.S. Coast Guard. A helicopter flew to the Alta on October 2nd to bring them some supplies. There was enough food for several days. Then, a rescue boat sailed to the ship. It evacuated all the sailors and delivered them to Puerto Rico before the hurricane. The Alta had to drift alone in the ocean. After a while, another ship approached the Alta to tow it to the shores of Guyana. But at this moment, everything went wrong. Someone stole the boat, disabled the tracking system, and sailed away in an unknown direction. After almost a year, the MS Protector found the empty Alta in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And then, 9 months later, the ship without a crew sailed to the shores of Ireland. How did it manage to travel across the Atlantic and get to the coast of Ireland? It's still a mystery. Maybe it was just luck. No one else saw the ship all this time. It was just covering huge distances, surviving storms. Who's the captain? What happened to the thieves? Who owns the ship now? One day, someone called the village administration and introduced themselves as the vessel owner. But that unknown person didn't provide any evidence. They found several barrels of oil on the ship, which they took away by helicopter. The Alta was rusting. Corrosion of metal could damage the environment. The vessel had no commercial value, yet it would have taken millions to get rid of it. There were 3 options for what to do: leave the ship where it was, tow it into the sea and let it sink, or disassemble it for scrap. But nature had its own plans. Storms and strong waves split the hull into 2 parts. The Alta was drifting without a crew in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean for about 2 years. But this is nothing compared to a ship that was traveling for 38 years. The record belongs to the SS Bechimo. It was a merchant vessel owned by some trading company. In 1931, the ship found itself on the ice off the coast of Alaska. Its movement slowed down. A thick layer of ice blocked the ship, and a strong storm only made the situation worse. The blizzard was so intense that the crew members couldn't see anything but a white veil in front of their eyes. Sailing any further was impossible. The team had to wait for the storm to end. They waited for a day, 2, 3 days. A week had passed, but the snowstorm was only getting stronger. Then, one day, it grew weaker. The crew members split into 2 teams. The first team went to the nearest city. The second group, along with the captain, stayed on board. They set up camp next to the ship and waited for the blizzard, which had started again, to end. There was 0 visibility. And finally, one day, the storm was over. Great! And now, wait a minute. But where is the ship? The SS Bechimo just disappeared during the blizzard. The captain was sure that the ship had sunk, so he left along with the crew. Then, a week later, they saw the vessel drifting near the area where they had lost it. The hull was damaged so severely that it was unsafe to sail on it. Repairing the ship would be pointless and expensive, so the captain decided to abandon it. He was sure that it would go underwater sooner or later, but it stayed afloat for the next few days, the next few months, and a few years. People had reported seeing it at various points along the coast of Alaska for 38 years. The last record of the SS Bechimo is dated 1969. Those who saw it claimed the ship was completely frozen, almost merged with the ice. Some people planned to start an expedition to find the ship, but all attempts were unsuccessful. The vessel is probably lying somewhere on the deep sea floor. April 1912 marked one of the most terrible tragedies in the history of the world. The most unsinkable vessel, the pinnacle of engineering at that time, the huge Titanic, sank. On that dark, moonless night, the ship had many chances to save its passengers. There was another ship just a few miles away that could have saved the Titanic, but it didn't. It wasn't a phantom ship, and it's not some legend or a theory. This is a documented reality. There are records and witnesses' statements confirming this, but why didn't this ship help? Let's find out what happened that night by looking at these events from 3 different points of view. Let's start with the Titanic version. 11:30 p.m. The moon hides behind black clouds. Visibility is bad. Everything is calm on the Titanic. Under the captain's guidance, the communications operator stays in touch with the mainland through the radio. At this moment, some stranger breaks into the frequency, interrupting the operator's communication. It's unclear what this strange man wants and what he's talking about. The operator doesn't try to figure it out. He shouts at the guy, demanding him to disconnect. The connection is interrupted. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic crashes into an iceberg. The ice breaks the hull. Water begins to flood the lower decks. Nobody is panicking yet. 20 minutes later, at midnight, the ship's crew sends a distress signal through the radio frequency. Few people understand how bad the situation really is. After 20 minutes, at 12:20 a.m., they start lowering lifeboats with passengers. At 12:25 a.m., they receive a response to the distress signal. This is RMS Carpathia. Their captain reports they're already sailing at maximum speed towards the Titanic. But the problem is that the crash site is 58 miles away. This means Carpathia will only be here in 4 hours. At 12:45 a.m., the sinking ship's crew release rockets into the air. These flares are one of the main reasons for the terrible fate of many passengers, but more on that later. 90 minutes later, the Titanic's deck breaks and the ship dives underwater. At 4:10 a.m., the Carpathia finally arrives at the shipwreck location. The crew members make heroic efforts to save all the people. They take 705 survivors on board. At this moment, another ship appears. It's SS Californian. The Carpathia sails towards the New York coast with all the people. The Californian floats in search of passengers and finds nothing but wreckage. The ship was only a few miles away while the Titanic sank into the icy water. The Californian could have saved these people, but did nothing. Its captain, Stanley Lord, made one of the most terrible acts that a sailor can allow. He didn't help a sinking ship. When the world found out about all this, they detested Captain Lord. They couldn't bring charges against him, and the trial didn't punish him. But his career was ruined entirely, as no other ship company would hire him. Despite this, he never confessed he had been guilty. Before he passed away, the captain said it hadn't been his fault. If this was true, then what happened there? This brings us to the Californian version. It's the night of April 14th. The Californian is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The ship gets into a section with a lot of icebergs. At 10:10 p.m., Captain Lord stops the ship. It's too dangerous to move around this area, as they can damage the hull. At 11 p.m., the ship starts drifting. It's impossible to move in such conditions with such poor visibility. The captain knows that the Titanic is coming here, so he orders the radio operator to warn the ship about the danger. Radio operator Evans turns on the receiver and tries to contact the Titanic. He spends about 30 minutes on it. The connection is finally established. At this moment, the Titanic radio operator is speaking with the mainland. Evans interrupts this conversation and tries to warn the ship about icebergs. The operator doesn't understand Evans' words. He's annoyed because Evans broke into the channel so brazenly. He shouts at Evans and cuts the connection. Tired, Evans turns off the receiver and informs his superiors about the incident. It's still a mystery how the captain reacted to this news. He probably thought the Titanic knew about the danger. He lets Evans go to bed. If Evans hadn't turned off the radio and waited 1 hour, he would have heard a distress signal from the Titanic. But you shouldn't blame him. At this point, he has no official reason to stay at the transmitter. Evans is too exhausted and can't fight drowsiness. So, Evans goes to bed. The Titanic begins to sink. Its captain sends a distress signal. The operator on board the Carpathia catches it, but the Californian doesn't, since the receiver is turned off. Captain Lord can't sleep. He feels that something is wrong. Meanwhile, the Titanic is rapidly sinking under the water. The captain gives the order to launch rockets into the air. And here is where one of the critical mistakes takes place. They release warning lights, but they are not red. The crew forgot to take red rockets on board for some reason, so they lit up the sky with a bright white light. If you need to send a distress signal, you need to release red lights. Captain Lord sees these lights, but doesn't perceive them as a cry for help. It can't be that there are no standard red rockets on such a massive ship as the Titanic. But, unfortunately, it can. Captain Lord thinks the Titanic is sailing away. Perhaps there is some unknown reason behind those white lights, but he doesn't really know. So, Captain Lord has no idea that the Titanic is sinking. He still decides to contact the ship, but this time, not through radio communication. Captain Lord doesn't wake up the radio operator and sends a signal to the Titanic through a signal lamp. It's important to understand that many old-school captains didn't take radio communication seriously. They didn't understand the value of this technology. That's why Captain Lord doesn't wake up Evans. He sends light signals, but the Titanic doesn't respond. Many survivors later mentioned seeing the flashing lights of the Californian, but there was nothing they could have done. The ship's crew doesn't hear their cries for help. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic completely goes underwater. A little more than 2 hours later, radio operator Evans wakes up and turns the transmitter on. He hears many rescuers talking about the sunken ship. Evans understands everything. He reports this to the captain. At that moment, the Californian immediately heads to the wreck site. They meet Carpathia there. With the survivors on board, it sails towards New York. The Californian stays sailing and looking for people. They find nothing but wreckage. The Californian returns to the mainland. The news about the ship that could have saved the Titanic is spreading all over the country. The trial begins. Captain Stanley Lord and the crew tell their version. They say their ship had been standing still. Many people don't believe them, and some of the surviving passengers claim to have seen the Californian sailing by. Still, the judge declares them innocent. 1962. Captain Stanley Lord is a very old man. He calls a notary to confess something. The captain makes his last remark about this case. He swears he's not guilty. But if it wasn't the Californian sailing past the Titanic at that moment, then what? The Samson theory could answer that question for us. The sealing ship Samson is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The crew aren't sleeping. They carefully study the surroundings, but not because they're afraid of icebergs. They're scared of meeting with the U.S. Coast Guard. The Samson ship's crew catch seals, which is illegal. At 12:45 a.m., Samson's captain sees white signal rockets. The team is sure it's the Coast Guard. They turn off the lights and sail away. It's dark, so they don't notice the sinking Titanic. They return to the coast of Iceland and hear about the disaster. They realize they have abandoned the drowning passengers. The nephew of one of Samson's crew members reads about this story in his uncle's diary. The nephew asks for permission to publish these recordings. All the people realize that Captain Lord wasn't guilty, but unfortunately, he didn't live to see this moment. Actually, it's still unknown who is guilty in this story. 2 ships were nearby the Titanic. Their captains were adequate people. They would have helped save all the passengers. Their fault was that they couldn't understand what the Titanic wanted on that dark night. Someone forgot to put red flares in the box. This small but fatal detail was one of the leading causes of the tragedy.
So in 2017, over 25 million people boarded cruise ships all over the world. Now, if you're keeping count, that's more than the total population of Greece. It's become America's favorite choice when it comes to going on vacation. It's easy to see why hopping aboard a cruise ship becomes more popular each year. Heading out on a cruise is also coming back in style with newer generations. 2/3 of Gen Y and millennials say that cruising is their new preferred type of vacation. How's that? Well, let's see. It's easy to plan in advance. On board, you can find activities for all family members, and you get a chance to visit several different destinations in one trip. An added bonus of booking a cruise? You can sample various places for a future time off. The entertainment on board is often top-notch, providing passengers with an added taste of luxury. And the amenities and accommodations are generally very reliable. Not to mention that it gives tourists that feeling of actually getting away from everything that people strive for while out of the office. Royal Caribbean International is one of the largest cruise lines in the world, with just over 19% of the cruise market as of 2018. Its current fleet is divided into many different classes of ships, including the Voyager class, Radiance, and Quantum. The latest addition to the Royal Caribbean International's impressive fleet was built in 2018. Wonder of the Seas is now the largest cruise ship in the world. Since this spectacular liner has just had her maiden voyage in March 2022, let's look at some of the incredible perks it has to offer its passengers. For starters, the boat is so big that it had to be split into neighborhoods. Well, it figures since Wonder of the Seas can accommodate almost 7,000 passengers. Fond of New York? Well, no worries. Wonder of the Seas has a central park of its own, with an estimated 10,000 plants to check out. The ship's central park is a feature of all Oasis-class ships, being one of the so-called neighborhoods. Let's look at some other areas, shall we? Like this boardwalk, a place that includes an arcade, a candy store, and a sports bar. It's best suited for long walks. There's a pool and sports zone on Wonder of the Sea. These areas feature the ship's numerous pools and hot tubs. There are many activities to check out on the sports court. Then there's the Royal Promenade, or Promenade if you prefer. That's the main road on Wonder of the Seas, with bars, lounges, and places to grab a cup of coffee, or a luxurious latte. The entertainment neighborhood is the focal point for leisure activities on the ship. Here, guests can find a comedy club, an ice skating rink, and even a theater. The spa and fitness area is a tranquil zone with a huge array of treatments available. The fitness center is free of charge, by the way, so there's no excuse for guests to skip a leg day. An extra 8th zone was added to Wonder of the Seas. It's called the Suite Neighborhood. This is an exclusive area designed for guests staying in the suites. Oh, now I get it. It's located at the top of the ship. Guests here have designated staff members called Royal Genies. Yeah, if you rub a lamp in your suite, they appear. Nah, not really. The genies are similar to butlers. They can cater to just a few cabins. Of course, the cruise line wants to divert other guests from asking these crew members various questions and taking their time. That's why the genies don't wear name tags in public areas. As for its itinerary, Wonder of the Seas was initially supposed to be homeported in China, but Royal Caribbean decided to move the liner to the United States. In March 2022, the ship started its journey with 7-night Eastern and Western Caribbean itineraries. In May 2022, Wonder of the Seas is scheduled for a trip to Europe, with Western Mediterranean cruises from Barcelona and Rome planned for its guests. Passengers will also be able to visit Palma de Mallorca, Spain, and Capri, Italy. When the summer season is over, Wonder of the Seas is scheduled to return to Florida to offer year-round sailing starting November 2022. And by the way, there is no truth to the rumor that a special cruise only for highly allergic and hay fever sufferers will be called the Wonder of the Sneeze. Nope, not at all. Now, it's hard to imagine a ship so massive that can accommodate so many amenities on board. For example, the Titanic was the largest ship of its time, measuring 882 feet in length. And Wonder of the Seas is not only 1,188 feet long, it's also 36% taller and 34% wider. Speaking of lifeboats, which I am about to, Titanic had a mere 20 lifeboats on board, which was tragically not enough to fit all the passengers after the ship hit the iceberg. But Wonder of the Seas has an even smaller number of lifeboats, 18 to be precise. Sounds weird and dangerous? Well, not really, given that each of these lifeboats can accommodate up to 370 people. It means that all the passengers and crew members, an estimated 8,000 people if fully booked, are going to be safe in case of an emergency. If we could somehow have a race between the two ships, well, Titanic was in fact the faster ship out of the two, beating Wonder of the Seas by 1 knot per hour. Cruise ship passengers today are more interested in the experience rather than the speed of the boat itself. That's why how fast a ship can travel is not an extremely important aspect nowadays. In terms of costs, Titanic cost around $7.5 million at the time of its construction. It's the equivalent of about $200 million today. How about Wonder of the Seas? Well, it cost a staggering $1.35 billion to build, making it 6 times more expensive than the Titanic. How about we compare ticket prices? Well, in this case, the least expensive ticket on Titanic was £7. It's about $1,000 today. The cheapest ticket on Wonder of the Seas is currently $423, but prices may vary depending on the location, season, itinerary, and how much you tip your Royal Genie. And I know you were going to ask, how about icebergs? Well, Titanic steamed in the frigid North Atlantic, where you had to be on the lookout for those. Wonder of the Seas will be cruising the balmy Caribbean, where the worst thing you can hit on is 17 in blackjack. Oops, busted. Anyway, set side by side with its other sisters from the Royal Caribbean fleet, Wonder of the Seas is equally as impressive. The company's earliest ships could host about 2,500 people. This included passengers and the staff. Such ships were Splendor of the Seas, Legends of the Seas, and the smallest of them all, Thumbelina of the Seas. No, wait, that should be Empress of the Seas. Oops, my bad. The largest ships in the company's fleet can now house about 9,000 people altogether. That's almost 3 times the size and capacity of the earlier liners. Wonder of the Seas is one of them, as well as Harmony of the Seas and Symphony of the Seas. Are you seeing a pattern here? Yep, if you ever encounter a ship with Of the Seas in its name, it's safe to assume it belongs to Royal Caribbean. But if it's a can of tuna, It might actually be chicken of the sea. Hey, I like tuna. Now, choosing between cruise ships based on their size is like wondering if you should visit your local museum or the Louvre in Paris. It all depends on your preferences. Some families prefer small settings. Others are fan of large spaces that can provide everything they need. Historically, it's equally as exciting how far we've come in terms of maritime transportation. The SS Royal William, for example, was the first boat to ever make a transatlantic voyage almost entirely steam-powered in 1833. And it was a mere 160 feet long and could house roughly 155 passengers. And if the seas were calm, then they were housed less roughly. Similarly, the first modern megaship in the world was the MS Sovereign of the Seas. Launched in 1987, it was only 888 feet long and could carry a little under 3,000 passengers. Size and capacity are not the single improvements added to newer cruise ships out there. Recent technological developments in artificial intelligence and facial recognition have allowed cruise operators to ensure faster, smoother boarding for passengers. If, in the past, it took from 60 to 90 minutes for all passengers to board a ship, nowadays, cruise ship operators manage to get people comfortably settled in less than 15 minutes. Now, I'm sure you're already eager to book a ticket, but let's look into some of the more interesting activities you can try on board Wonder of the Seas. This way, you'll know what you're getting yourself into. All Royal Caribbean ships have loads of artworks available for their guests to enjoy. But Wonder of the Seas goes above and beyond, even featuring statues of astronauts in key locations around the ship. You'll find the first astronaut looking through the glass at the promenade, while a second one is busy rock climbing at the boardwalk. The third and last astronaut is more of a movie fan. This statue can be found near the movie screen sitting area. Going astronaut sightseeing is proving to be quite the experience among guests. In the areas with no access to sunlight, Wonder of the Seas features virtual balconies. In case of bad weather, guests can still have a feeling of the outdoors, but without having to hide from wind or rain. Teenagers have a place of their own reserved on the ship. There's a special club with a private hot tub, selfie area, games, and comfortable seating. The inside part of this club features a vending machine, an interesting collection of literature, and tables for foosball. Well, sign me up. Welcome to the race across the globe. And here are our competitors. He is the captain of the world's largest freight ship, which can hold almost 24,000 containers. This is the captain of the Antonov AN-225 Mriya, the world's largest cargo airplane, the record holder in aviation, which uses 6 engines to take off. Over here is the freight engineer. The train reaches a length of about 2.5 miles. That is, the walk from the head of the train to its tail will take a whole hour. And our last contestant is the driver of the Kenworth W990, one of the world's largest and most powerful trucks. All of them will make a crazy trek from the port of Shanghai to Portugal. They will move through water, air, roads, and rails to bring you that container of delicious fruit to your table, or at least to your local store. You take it the last mile. So, here we go! Shanghai. It's the busiest port in the world. Every year, 43,300,000 containers load and unload here. And here's your container. This is a standard 20-foot equivalent unit. There are several kinds of containers, and they're the same all over the planet. These things have changed our world and brought a real revolution in cargo shipping. Way back, 70 years ago, goods and products, or cargo, was loaded and unloaded onto ships with human power. The loaders had to move every individual bag and box, and it would take days to fill up a ship. A truck driver waiting in a long line for his turn to load stuff on a ship thought, what if we didn't move the cargo separately, but could put a whole truck onto the ship? Ooh, he's thinking on the bright side. Well, a few decades later, the first container appeared. Now the loader in the port didn't have to spend time moving every single piece of cargo. A giant crane would hoist an entire loaded container all at once. Then, in 1956, this reduced the cost of loading 1 ton of freight from $6 to 16 cents, 37 times. You can fit 2 cars in one of those containers, or 3,500 shoeboxes, or 500,000 chicken eggs. There's also containers for bulk goods like grain. They have an airlock at the bottom. There's also refrigerated containers. They're used to deliver fruit to all corners of our planet. The invention of these standard containers made the shipping industry way more efficient. Let's return to our present day. This real-time map shows all the ships in the world's oceans. See how the port of Shanghai glows? Dozens of ships unload and load containers here every day. The total fleet of these giant container ships is about 5,400 units worldwide. And here's our hero vessel. This big boy is 1,300 feet long. Its nose is 330 feet higher than the Eiffel Tower. Its engine measures as tall as a 5-story building. Right now, dozens of cranes are loading containers inside the ship. Then they put a lid on the hold and stack even more containers on the deck. The maximum is 23,992 containers. Their total weight can be about 235,580 tons. That's like, 39,000 adult elephants. That's if you do the math. To move all this mass, its giant engine has about 78,500 horsepower. The fastest commercial car, the Koenigsegg Agera RS, made in Sweden, has only 1,341 horsepower, so that's not nearly enough. Now, you'd think it would take a huge team to drive such a giant, right? Nope, no more than 20 people. This is the captain. Several assistant captains oversee each deck: the engine crew, the helmspersons, and the tech crew. And the most important people on the ship? The cook and his assistant. Hey, you gotta keep that crew happy, right? The captain orders start the engines, and the crew gets to work. Tugboats help the colossal container ship slip out into the bay. Meanwhile, we're loading the world's largest cargo airplane at Shanghai Airport, AN-225 Mira. Check this out. The first flight of the Wright brothers airplane was shorter than the size of this plane's cargo compartment. Wow! Its fuselage is as long as the height of a 15-story building, and the wingspan is as wide as 6 school buses are long. This plane was originally designed to launch spaceships from the air. It would take off from the runway, carrying the spaceship on its back. Here, we load the plane through the front. The nose of the aircraft rises, opening the cargo hold. At the same time, the airplane squats on its landing gear. The largest airplane in the world can take no more than 7 20-foot containers into the cargo area. The nose closes, and the pilot gives the crew the cue to get going. Usually, even the largest commercial airliners are flown by only 2 people. But the AN-225 Mira needs a 6-person crew: a commander, co-pilot, 2 flight engineers, a navigator, and a radio operator. No cook, huh? Whatever. It's time to start all 6 engines. Each of them generates 12,500 horsepower at liftoff. The airplane accelerates more and more, and at last, all 32 wheels come off the runway. And the fastest commercial car, Koenigsegg Agera RS, is left in the dust. Alright now, let's look at our train. Oh, it's already on its way. The workers have loaded the train with containers right at the port. They just put the containers on a special car, which is the right size. If there are no low tunnels on the track, we can even stack containers, one on top of the other. Given that our train has about 250 cars, we could load 500 containers on it. Now, if we pencil that out, the maximum loading capacity of the train is 48 times less than that of the ship. But the crew that runs the train consists of just 2 people. This makes train deliveries incredibly cheap. But both crew members have a working day. After 12 hours on the road, the train stops at a station. A new crew takes their seats in the train's locomotive and continues on their way. The first crew spends the night in a hotel, has a nice dinner, and in the morning swaps crews with another train heading back to their hometown. Now, let's look at the map. This is the entire distance the train will have to travel, almost 7,000 miles. That's 3 times the width of the United States from coast to coast. On average, freight trains travel at about 50 miles per hour. Our calculator tells us the whole trip will take about 140 hours or 6 days. But hey, it's not that simple. You see, areas are divided into railroad zones. One crew always works within one particular zone. For example, our train crew departed from the port of Shanghai and reached the border of their area. They must stop the train and give up control to the next crew. So, the travel time for the train will depend on the speed of the transfers and the number of stops. So what about our truck? Back at the Shanghai port, the truck got its container very quickly. It pulled up to the loading area, and a big crane gently dropped the container on it directly from the ship. Done. Much faster than a plane or a train. From this point on, its journey began. The truck's route will be about the same as the train's. The average speed of the truck is about 60 miles per hour. If driving non-stop, the journey would take 5 days. But one driver can only work a certain number of hours. A working day lasts 14 hours, of which the truck can only drive 9. When he has reached his limit, the truck driver must find a suitable place to rest and recuperate. You've probably seen the trucker parking lots along the highway. They look like big gas stations. Here, the driver can always take a shower and eat. The driver will sleep right in the truck. The Kenworth W990 has a special place for this right behind the driver's cab. And there's not only a bed there, no, there's separate air conditioning, windows, lights, and several compartments for personal belongings. There's a refrigerator to store groceries and a microwave to heat food. The driver can eat at the folding table and even watch TV, everything to make the driver feel at home. So, when one driver has reached its limit of 9 hours and his workday is over, he has to rest for the remaining 10 hours until tomorrow. In this case, he'll cover a maximum of 540 miles per day. That adds up to 13 days of travel time. Additionally, the truck must pass inspection when entering other countries or states. Inspectors weigh the truck on giant scales, check its brakes, and more. It's time-consuming too. In this case, the solution is to have a partner. At the end of a 14-hour shift, the first driver must go to the cab to sleep and rest. Then the partner takes over control and continues on the road for the next 14 hours. But there's a problem here. When the second driver finishes his shift, the first driver still can't get behind the wheel, so they still have to stop. Shifting gears, back to our giant container ship. It comes out of the bay and suddenly it slows down. Yes, that's all for the economy. The East China Sea is very busy near the port. Dozens of ships are waiting in line to get into port. So the captain gave the order to increase speed so as not to hold up the party. But as the ship entered the open sea, it slowed down to about 20 knots. That's about 23 miles per hour. That's very slow, especially if we look at their route. It's a trip nearly across the globe. The total distance from the port of Shanghai to Portugal by sea is about 11,000 miles. But our ship moves almost non-stop, 24/7. Ideally, it would take 480 hours or 20 days. But there are a few variables out there for a ship on the open seas. Take storms, for example. The ocean can be a rough place. Sometimes the waves there reach great heights, enough to overturn even a ship this big. So the captain heads to the bridge and takes control. The navigator turns the ship's bow into the wave to keep it from overturning the vessel. The bow of the ship rises and rushes into the sky. Once on top, the ship begins to plunge off the wave like a surfer, picking up speed. After a few seconds, the bow hits the water hard, causing a solid splash of water. High and narrow waves can be especially hazardous. Coming down for them, the ship can dive too much underwater, almost like an arrow, and go under. Or worse, it might break in two under its weight. But fortunately, the wise captain overcame the storm and we arrived at the first checkpoint of the voyage. This is the Strait of Malacca. All ships traveling from Asia go through this bottleneck. Otherwise, they would have to make a long detour through Indonesia. The Strait of Malacca is not only narrow, but also shallow. If the ship's depth in the water, or draft, is deeper than 65 feet, it will run aground, and that's not good. That's why we don't build ships bigger than this one. But our giant makes it through and into the Indian Ocean. Now, look up into the sky. The largest aircraft in the world, the AN-225, is now in the air at cruising altitude. That's about 5.6 miles. The planes choose this altitude for several reasons. The atmosphere here is not as dense as below, so the airplane has less air resistance or drag and burns less fuel. Another reason is bad weather, which just doesn't exist here. Thus, neither rain nor snow is a problem for it. Now, given the curvature of the Earth, the direct distance between Shanghai and Portugal is about 6,500 miles. The cruising speed of the AN-225 is 500 miles per hour. That means the plane can cover this distance in just 13 hours, compared to 13 days for our truck. But the aircraft will have to make at least one stop. Considering that such a huge plane can't land at all airports because it needs a long runway, refueling stops should be carefully chosen. The airport in Dubai has a long enough runway so that the AN-225 can land there. The captain begins the descent procedure. Such a heavy plane needs to calculate the weight for landing accurately. If it's too heavy, the plane's landing gear might break and lead to an accident, which really should be avoided. This is why planes sometimes make several circles around the airport to burn any excess fuel. The weight of the remaining fuel can be critical for landing, so the aircraft captain makes sure the tank is properly empty and lands the plane. When empty, the AN-225 Mira can cover a distance of 9,570 miles. That's enough to get from Alaska in North America to the most southern point of South America, or from New York to London and back. But when loaded with cargo, that distance is almost cut in half. The captain lands the plane and brings it to a stop. Time to feed the beast. AN-225 has 13 tanks under the wings. Combined, they hold 300 tons of fuel. It could take a day and a half and several dozen refueling trucks to fill such a behemoth. So, while the plane is paused, the train has a chance to catch up with it in the race. But there's an issue here too. Different countries have different standards for railroad tracks. The track width in China may be different from the track width in the Middle East and Europe. Yep, we have to change the width between the train's wheels to keep going. In the past, we would stop the train completely to do this. Then we would lift it and change the distance of each pair of wheels by hand. Given that one car has 4 pairs of wheels and we have over 200 cars, well, this process could take forever. We might as well just unload the train entirely and load the containers onto another one. But now, we can adjust the width of the train's wheel sets right on the move. Now, let's get back on the road again. Whew, our driver just flew by. Well, actually just drove by. A truck like this is indeed the king of the road. It measures 300 inches between the front and rear wheels. And if you add the trailer, it's longer than a school bus, 53 feet. Such a big truck has an impressive weight of 18,000 pounds. That's more than a grown elephant, or as big as 4 sedans. Naturally, the truck has a massive 12.9-liter engine. The average sedan has an engine 6 times smaller. It gives the truck about 500 horsepower, so you can easily pull even a hefty load up a steep hill. The main thing is to make sure that you have fuel. Well, aren't we lucky? The Kenworth W990 has a huge 225-gallon fuel tank. That's 20 times bigger than an average passenger car has, or even that Koenigsegg Algira RS. To fill up such a tank, the pump at the gas station has to go for at least 25 minutes. Hope you're not in a hurry. But this truck is pretty efficient. It can go 6.5 miles burning 1 gallon of fuel, so a full tank will allow the truck to make a trip of almost 1,500 miles. Hey, you can cross the United States from coast to coast with just one stop to refuel. On our 7,000-mile route from Shanghai to Portugal, the truck driver will have to make 5 refueling stops. Meanwhile, back at sea, the captain of the largest container ship in the world looks through binoculars and sees land. The crew has reached one of the busiest waterways in the world, the Suez Canal. It's a narrow strip of water that connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. It's the shortest route from Asia to Europe. If it were not for the canal, the ships would have to go around all of Africa, adding another 5,000 miles and consuming tons of fuel and lots more days. Now, an alternative ocean route is through the North Sea, but commercial cargo ships use it only in the summer when the ice is melted and there's a lower risk sailing. At colder times of the year, ships need the help of icebreakers. These are large, powerful ships whose sole purpose is to plow through the ice, clearing the way for cargo ships. But icebreaker services are very expensive, which drastically increases the delivery cost. Now, getting through the Suez Canal is not that easy. You can look at the sea traffic in real time. There are dozens and hundreds of ships lined up to go through it. The canal is about 250 feet wide. That means our ship can go through it with a small margin. but our cargo is too heavy and the ship could run aground. In this case, the ships that work for the Suez Canal come to the rescue. Some of the containers are reloaded onto them. Our ship becomes lighter and no longer runs aground. The captain receives a message that it's his ship's turn. Tugboats help the giant container ship move through the narrow canal. The ship must navigate 100 miles in a narrow canal to reach the Mediterranean Sea. Other ships are moving from Europe to Asia and moving toward it through the canal. There are special places where the canal widens for the boats to bypass each other. There is also a recently built parallel canal. It's wider and it allows larger ships to go through there, and it even allows ships to go both ways. On average, the passage through the canal takes about 14 hours. In one day, the Suez Canal can pass about 50 ships. Hundreds of other vessels on both sides of the canal have to wait in line. The ship's captain keeps a close eye on the passage through the canal. Even the slightest mistake can lead to a massive pileup. In March 2021, one of the largest container ships in the world blocked the Suez Canal. It was carrying about 18,000 containers. Strong winds blew the ship off course as it passed through the canal. The ship's bow ran aground on one side of the canal. Its stern was then blown sideways, beaching on the opposite side. So, this one ship completely blocked the passage from Asia to Europe in both directions. As they say, wanna get away? Well, for several days, 14 tugboats tried unsuccessfully to move the giant ship. Then the excavators began to dig out the sand under the ship's bow. Their goal was to deepen the bottom of the canal so the boat could float again. Every minute counted. Meanwhile, more and more ships were bumper to bumper in the Mediterranean and Red Seas. By the end of the rescue operation, roughly 450 different ships were impatiently waiting for their turn to pass through the canal. The world trade lost about $400 million every hour. Delivery schedules for goods around the world flew out the window. The biggest losses were for oil tankers from the Middle East. Fortunately, our captain made no mistakes, and the giant container ship made it through the Suez Canal without incident. The captain sets a new course. This is the last leg of this long voyage. Alright, where's our biggest airplane in the world? It's already slicing through the skies on its finish line. It's now in European airspace. It's interesting that in addition to being a record center in size and payload, this plane is only one of a kind. The first flight of this giant took place in 1988. Although 34 years old, it's still going strong and does its job. It was recently certified to continue flying until at least 2033. It's one of the few planes that have unusual tail fins. It's split. As I said earlier, the AN-225 was originally designed to carry spacecraft on its back. But the spaceship created an aerodynamic instability on the plane's tail. So, the engineers had to give the aircraft a double tail shape. But despite the attachments on the roof of the plane, it never carried cargo there. This is because of the aerodynamic requirements for shipment. When the AN-225 took a spaceship, it had all the properties to reduce air resistance. But if you hitch a square container to the roof of the plane, the aerodynamics will get worse dramatically. Essentially, you get a flying toaster oven. Well, the captain just turned off the autopilot and took control of the plane. This means that he is about to start the descent. Time to put your seatbacks and tray tables into their locked upright position. The appearance of an AN-225 Mira in the air always attracts lots of attention. It can be recognized by its triple track in the sky. This is because of 6 engines and the split tail. The plane lowers the landing gear. All 32 wheels are ready to touch the ground. Cars passing by the airport stop. People get out and pull out their phones to take a video of this giant. 30 feet, 20, 10, and touchdown. The plane slows down and finally stops. Now it's time to get that precious cargo out. It takes about 7 minutes to open the cargo hatch. The plane drops a little lower and unfolds the ramp. The cargo trucks begin unloading the containers. The plane finishes our race. It took 2 days from Shanghai Airport to Portugal with one technical stop for refueling. What about the train? The locomotive of the train has already replaced several dozen crews. Its route took it through Beijing, Moscow, and Paris, but it's still much shorter than the possible longest route in the world, Portugal-Singapore. The total length of the track on this route is 11,655 miles. If you wanted to make this journey by passenger train, it would take about 21 days to get from point A to B. Our train route was a little shorter, and it took 12 days to get to the destination. That's 6 times longer than an airplane. Now to the truck driver. He too is nearly at the finish line. His route practically repeats the ancient Silk Road, the route Chinese merchants used to carry silk to the Middle East. The truck went nose to nose with the train all the way there. The truck would overtake the train when it was stopped to change crews, but the train would pull ahead while the truck driver was asleep in the cab and couldn't continue driving. The truck reached its destination a little later than the train, 13 days. The last participant of the race, the world's largest container ship. It started simultaneously with the other participants from the port of Shanghai. Its route went through the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. It passed through the extremely narrow Suez Canal to reach the Mediterranean Sea. Its final checkpoint is the Strait of Gibraltar, the stretch of water that separates Europe from Africa. Finally, it has arrived in the port of Portugal. The ship makes a Victory Hawk. The captain looks through his binoculars and sees that the AN-225 crew, train crew, and the truck driver are already standing on the coast. He crossed the finish line last. The whole trip took this ship 20 days. See how the places are arranged on the pedestal: the airplane, the train, the truck, and the ship. Now, the plane wins if we compete just for speed, but each of the participants takes first place in a particular category. Which of the contestants in the race deliver the goods as cheaply as possible? Let's look at the train. To move 1 ton of cargo for 1 mile, you have to pay 4 cents. So if you want to ship a ton of freight from Los Angeles to New York, it'll cost you about $100. In our case, with a train route of about 7,000 miles, the shipping price of 1 ton of goodies would be about $280. The price is low because of the train's efficiency. It has smooth metal wheels that run on smooth metal rails, so it doesn't have much drag like a truck with rubber tires on asphalt. Meanwhile, let's look at the airplane. It takes $1.21 to move 1 ton of cargo per mile. The route covered by the AN-225, including a stop for refueling in Dubai, is approximately 7,800 miles. That means the cost of shipping 1 ton of cargo will be roughly $9,500. That's 34 times more expensive than by train, though 6 times faster. But this is the price for modern and fuel-efficient aircraft. The AN-225 engines are old and not as efficient. They burn more fuel, and the price will be even higher. Regarding the truck, 1 ton per mile costs 20 cents. So shipping from Shanghai to Portugal costs about $1,400, 5 times more expensive than a train. In recent years, the price of shipping a container by cargo ship has increased 7 times. It costs about $14,000 to ship cargo from China to Europe. Prices have gone up so much because of the container shortage. Internet commerce is growing fast, and so is the need for consistent shipments across the globe. We just don't have enough containers to meet those needs, but we expect the price of ocean shipping to drop by 2023. So the shipping method should always be chosen carefully. An airplane is best for delivering expensive goods that are needed urgently. The train is perfect for a large volume of goods, which at the same time is cheap. We primarily use trains to move containers from seaports to distribution points farther inland. The main advantage of trucks is their mobility. They can take containers to places the train can't reach because there is no railroad, or where there is no access to water, and it's impossible to deliver the cargo by ship. Trucks can also deliver goods directly to city centers. Shipping on giant container ships is suitable for huge amounts of cargo, for something not too heavy, but something you can fill a container to the top. Despite the price, most of the goods in your nearest supermarket are brought in by ship. They have traveled thousands of miles in containers around the world. Globalization happens thanks to the container. The same product costs just about the same price all over the world. People in different parts of the planet can wear the same sneakers and eat the same fruit because, a while back, someone invented a way to transport stuff we all like to buy in universal containers. Giant container ships are responsible for much of the global trade. Thanks to them, you receive your orders from overseas, sooner or later. But they do have a problem just like any mechanical vessel. They tend to break down. That's where these little bad boys come in. Tugboats are meant to help any stranded vessel that either lost power or sustained any technical or physical damage. Besides being salvage vessels, tugboats also help guide ships when they dock. Since these ships are massive, underline, They require little tugboats to survey the surroundings and help them navigate to dock properly. They also serve as firefighting boats in case a fire breaks loose in the ship. Many of these cargo ships already have a system to stop fires, but tugboats provide extra help in case the fire gets out of control. Many cargo ships pass through below-zero regions like the Arctic and face plenty of obstacles, or icicles. Tugboats to the rescue again! They can make the first move by breaking the ice so that the vehicle can pass through without damaging itself or delaying its course. They also help large ships move through narrow areas. On March 23, 2021, the Ever Given, one of the largest container ships in the world, got stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days. It froze global shipping of almost $10 billion of trade in a day. The Suez Canal is one of the most important routes for trading, but happens to be quite narrow for its purpose. To put that into perspective, it's like the Empire State Building getting lodged in the middle of a busy freeway. So, if you were wondering why your delivery was late during that month, it's probably because of that incident. The bottom of the ship nearly touched the floor of the canal. In the early morning of March 23rd, the weather was acting up. It was getting worse and worse, with the wind picking up to around 45 miles per hour. Those were some terrible weather conditions for navigation. That should have been the first red flag, but the Canal Authority didn't have a system for monitoring weather conditions or warning ships about them. The captain, Krishnan Kantavel, ignored the signs and decided just to go with it, not knowing the perils and the consequences ahead. The Egyptian pilots that were assisting with the navigation failed to provide proper instructions. As a result, the ship became jammed diagonally, essentially blocking the whole canal. The canal authorities didn't provide tugboats for some reason, which is why it was stuck for 6 days. Things were so bad, they had to bring excavation diggers to remove some land for the ship to properly turn back to normal. So, these little tuggers are really important for world trading to work. The vessels are getting bigger and bigger, with the world depending on import and export more than ever. They're built for going long distances rather than maneuvering in tight spaces and corners. The tugboats are surrounded by a material that won't scratch or damage the vessel, kind of like bumper cars at the carnival. They can either push or pull. But one thing's for sure, more than one is needed to help a ship get back on its aquatic feet. Ships don't have a lot of water passing over the rudder for them to turn quickly, and they risk damaging the engine if they push it too hard. They can either tow it directly or indirectly. The tug is pulling the vessel either in front of it or from side to side. They can also push it from one side to another. These tiny boats are like ants compared to giant ships. Their success secret is that they're floating on the water, which means there's no solid foundation for them to struggle. As a result, pushing and pulling is easy. Many newer tugboats have 2 large diesel-powered engines. There are also some electric models which are good for the environment and still do their job well. Shipping boats in general are better for the environment than trucks and planes, but are slower. Shipping vessels mainly carry food, clothing, electronics, furniture, and my stuff. The biggest ship can carry the Eiffel Tower on its back like it's no big deal, although getting it over to the ship would be. They're 1,000 times more powerful than a regular car. If all the containers in the world were arranged in a pile, it would cover half the planet. If you ever walked on a beach in the 90s and saw what appeared to be a rubber ducky, you weren't dreaming. In 1992, a shipping crate holding 28,000 rubber ducks was lost at sea while journeying from Hong Kong to the U.S. They say it fell off the ship and has been around the world's oceans for more than 20 years. What seemed like a horrible accident that would leave dire consequences for the world's marine ecosystem proved to also be helpful for us to learn and understand the world of plastic pollution and how the ocean currents work. These ducks seem to have had quite the journey when they broke free from their container life. Some reports show they got washed up on the shores of Alaska, South America, Hawaii, Pacific Northwest, Scotland, Australia, and even froze in the Arctic. Rather than making their way to thousands of bathrooms in the U.S., they went rogue and backpacked around the world to see what else lies beyond tiled walls and bubble baths. Many were collected and removed from the seas and oceans, while some are still out there. There are around 2,000 of these duckies circulating in the currents of the North Pacific Gyre. In case you were wondering, that's a place where the currents meet and whirl with one another between Japan, Alaska, Kodiak, and the Aleutian Islands. They've even created a website to track these ducks down with a contact form that lets people inform of one or many ducks they find across the world. But who knows? Maybe we'll never recover every single duck that was lost at sea at the time. This is just one incident out of many. Studies show that at least 2,000 to 10,000 shipping containers are lost at sea every year. Many containers that do slip off and fall into the sea don't always sink to the bottom. They're floaters. On the downside, they don't float high enough to become colorful islands that are easy to notice. They float like icebergs, with just the top of the container showing, which means that any passing ship or boat won't see it from above. If they pass through it, then significant damage can happen to the ship. They can't stay floating forever, so they end up sinking after many days of being suspended in the open water. Some people have even seen shipping containers washed up on shore after being stranded at sea. These bad boys have been made to last for a very long time. If you take proper care of them, the life expectancy of each container can stretch for more than 20 years. It's pretty amazing that they travel all over the world and are filled and refilled with new items many times. They go through all sorts of weather conditions and have to survive in different climates. Many modern houses are made out of retired shipping containers designed with a nice aesthetic touch. Shipping container houses provide the exact same living conditions, except they look cool. Besides looking cool, they're economically friendly compared to regular houses. You can save plenty of money with the structure pretty much halfway done. All that's needed is just a little foundation and a few adjustments here and there, and boom, you've got yourself a house. You're also doing the world a favor by contributing to the environment. Those homes are recycled containers that have just been refurbished and polished for anyone to live in. They're good enough to live in freezing conditions and scorching weather. The industry is booming, so you can have your new home delivered to you within 10 weeks. You can customize it before they build it for you. It's easy to transport since it's not heavy, it's just bulky. You can predict your cost without the surprise payments that might follow. Many of these containers start their journey in a steel yard and travel all over the world. And in the end, they retire in a nice piece of land and host families that will get to be a part of their history. Wow, I can hardly contain myself. That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and stay on the bright side.